the philosophers were interested, the psychologists were interested, anthropologists were interested, literary theorists were interested, educators were interested. Who else?
Linguists.
Oh, linguists too. There were linguists. And somehow it was very exciting at that time. And over the next 10 or so years, I think the allure of linguistics faded to a certain extent, to a great extent, I think, outside of linguistics. The linguists carried on for many years as though this was a new, exciting, and a revolutionary enterprise, but the rest of the world sort of said ho-hum and went on doing other things like connectionism and neural imaging and all kinds of other things. So one of the questions that most linguists didn't even notice, because there were plenty of other linguists to talk to and plenty of conferences to go to, but those of us who cared about talking to other disciplines noticed that we were not held in such high repute as we once were. So part of the question that I asked myself is, what happened to linguistics? And to some degree what happened was just a matter of intellectual fashion. The skirts go up and down from year to year. The hot intellectual topic changes from year to year. So there was connectionism and there was neural imaging. But I think in addition there were some important intellectual reasons, scientific reasons, why linguistics did not live up to the promise that it had in the 1960s. And that's really what I want to talk about more than the sociology, although the sociology, the history, does play a role in my story. So first I want to talk about what I think the promise of linguistics was. And this mostly comes from the one of the founding documents of generative grammar, Chomsky's book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, which was brand new when I got to graduate school. The first, I think it's founded on really three important pillars that are still absolutely relevant today, that have formed a basic part of all of cognitive science. One is that we should be studying language in terms of what is happening in the mind of a language user, rather than seeing language as some abstract phenomenon or something that is situated out there in the community. We should be interested in what's going on in here when we speak and understand language. The second important basic point, which goes back to even earlier work of Chomsky's, to his syntactic structures, is the idea that language is combinatorial. The idea that we are not just using a fixed number of signals like let's say most primate communities, most primate species. Rather, there's an unlimited number of different sentences that we can speak and understand. And what that means is, because we can't store an unlimited number of sentences in our brains, we must have a set of combinatorial principles or rules or mental grammar as part of what's in our heads, in addition to some stock of words that these rules put together. And what made it not just sort of an existence proof, there must be rules, but made it really exciting, was that Chomsky, for the first time, was able to use formal techniques from recursive function theory and various things from foundations of mathematics to actually talk about what the rules of language are like in a way that was not previously possible. So that when we were graduate students, we were busy discovering new rules for English and other languages, and we had the techniques for writing them and showing how the rules interacted, and it was all, the mechanics were just absolutely fascinating. And that's part of what the excitement was. Now the third part, which really made it revolutionary, was Chomsky pointing to the fact that, well, in learning a language, we must be internalizing these rules of grammar. The child must be acquiring the rules. And yet, since the rules are totally inaccessible to the consciousness of speakers, the rules can't be directly taught. And even if you did know them consciously, the child couldn't understand them because the child can't speak yet. So the child must be internally constructing these rules on the basis of hearing sentences spoken out in the world, so that it's giving the child a very active part in the process of language acquisition, not just sitting there soaking up the language, but actively taking this input and constructing a grammar with which he or she will then go out and speak sentences. And then Chomsky asked the very important question, how could the child possibly do this? And he suggested that the child must know something about language in advance. Language can't be just acquired through drawing statistical generalizations over sentences that the child hears in the world. Rather, the child must have something built in that tells it in advance what kinds of generalizations to look for. And this is what he called universal grammar. Or it wasn't called universal grammar in aspects. I think the term actually showed up about 2 years later. And then the question arose, is universal grammar something that is a human cognitive specialization for language? Is this something that humans have and, let's say, chimpanzees don't? And the quest then is to decide what parts of the machinery that the child needs to acquire language are special to humans and what parts might be generalizations of other capacities that were already pre-existing. This has turned up recently in Chomsky's rhetoric, where he talks about the narrow language faculty versus the broad language faculty, where the narrow language faculty is the part you need specifically to learn language, and the broad language faculty is everything you need to learn language, including the things that might be used for other purposes in humans and in other animals as well. And of course, the battles over the past 35 to 40 years have been, is there a universal grammar? Is there some human cognitive specialization? And for the most part, I think the people outside of linguistics have been much more skeptical than the linguists, let's put it that way. And the battles go back and forth over those sorts of lines. Now, the fourth piece of the aspects position that made, which I think is the part that made everybody the most excited, was this notion of deep structure. The idea is that language has to eventually provide a mapping between sounds and meanings. And Chomsky proposed, as part of the, partly on syntactic grounds, but partly on semantic grounds as well, that there has to be a layer of syntactic structure which looks more like meaning than the string of words we see on the surface. And this was called deep structure, and the great technical innovation was the notion of transformations that turn deep structure into surface structure. And over the 10 years from syntactic structures to aspects, there was a lot of debate about how syntactic structure is related to meaning. And in aspects, Chomsky proposed, following a proposal of Katz and Postel of 1964, that deep structure is the level of syntactic structure that is most closely related to meaning. In different formulations of this hypothesis, the strength of the hypothesis sort of varied. So sometimes he said the deep structure encodes the meaning or expresses the meaning. Sometimes he said, well, the deep structure is the thing from which you derive meaning. Sometimes he gave you the impression that the deep structure is the meaning. So, for example, there's a footnote in aspects where he refers to the Port-Royal grammar, and he says they thought that the deep structure is a relatively clean encoding of meaning. And he refers to Humboldt talking about Tiefenstruktur and Oberflächenstruktur, or deep structure and surface structure. And he says, I have roughly in mind what Humboldt meant. Well, you know that Port Royal grammar and Humboldt did not have in mind a level of syntactic structure. When they talked about deep structure, they were talking about meaning. But Chomsky did not exactly discourage you from thinking he meant meaning as well, although he never directly said it. He's, very careful about how the rhetoric is suggestive and how it's not. In any event, this is what got everybody the most excited. Because they said, look, we now have an analysis which leads us to meaning, to human thought. If anything is going to tell us about human nature, it's the character of thought, and therefore the character of deep structure. And so this is the ultimate philosophical problem, the ultimate psychological problem. Meaning is really sexy. Syntactic structure, it's just technical stuff. But meaning, if you can get at meaning, you've really got it. Now, what happened right after that? There came to be a small number of people who actually grew very rapidly in numbers, who took the idea seriously that deep structure is very closely related to meaning. And in doing so, they made deep structure further and further away from the syntactic surface structure. And eventually, by 1968, Macaulay was proposing that, in fact, there's no separate deep structure for meaning. Deep structure really is meaning, and deep structure is sort of a predicate calculus or quantificational logic sort of representation. And so this became the theory of generative semantics. And everybody who loved deep structure for its closeness to meaning absolutely adored generative semantics. So the whole world outside of MIT became generative semanticists. Chomsky was not so happy. He didn't think it was right, and he attacked these people like crazy. And his then current students, as opposed to his former students who became generative semanticists, his current students like me and Kullikover and Akhmajian took Chomsky's side. And so we were at the receiving end of all of this, all the reaction to Chomsky. Chomsky would say nasty things about them, and they would say nasty things about us. And it was a very traumatic time for the field. For me personally as well. I think, 25 years of therapy later, I can sort of talk about it. And of course, Chomsky won, because he always wins. But there was a twist to it, because when he came out of this battle, he said, oh no, I never meant deep structure to have anything to do with meaning. It was just a level of syntax. And in fact, meaning comes from both deep structure and surface structure. And that was one of his, that was the basis of one of his major attacks on the generative semanticists. And I guess it was part of my dissertation as well. And so what happened to all the people who thought generative grammar was great? They said, he was going to give us meaning. And now the people who really were going to give us meaning, he's torn them to shreds, and he says he's not going to give us meaning. The hell with him. And so a lot of people, and I have this, both in print and personal interviews with people, they said, when this happened, I said, Chomsky, people say, when this happened, I felt that Chomsky had deceived us. And I didn't want to have anything to do with generative grammar anymore. And so many of them rejected generative grammar, and with it they rejected the notion of innateness, and with it they many of them rejected the notion of language being in the mind, and many of them rejected the notion of rules. And so we had a lot of people going back to sort of associationist psychology, and associationist psychology applied in computational linguistics, as happened later on with the connectionists. And that was the first step in grammar being left, in generative linguistics being left by the wayside in cognitive science. From there, of course, Chomsky got interested in constraints on movement transformations, which had nothing to do with meaning. So it got very technical, and people said, why should I learn this stuff? You know, it's not telling me about meaning anymore. It's just all this technical foo-fa-ra about, bounding nodes and barriers and government and all these kinds of things. It's not interesting at all. So they abandoned following the literature, and they had to because it got much more difficult. And the linguists, of course, continued doing their syntax and didn't pay much attention to the rest of the world. And that was really the beginning of the split. Now, I think, so that's sort of the historical part, but I think in addition to that, there was a very important mistake that has been run throughout all of the Chomskyan versions of generative grammar from the very start. And it's what I call the assumption of syntactocentrism. The idea is Chomsky made a great deal, put out a great deal of effort to show that language is generative, and then he assumed, and then he figured out a way to make syntax generative. And then he assumed that all of the generativity of language comes from syntax. So what does that mean? Well, even in aspects, this comes out. He states it as an assumption. He says in several places, I assume that semantics is interpretive and phonology is interpretive. What does that mean? All of the combinatorial power of the language is invested in the phrase structure rules, which create the trees. The transformations move the trees around and massage them, and then at some level of syntactic derivation, you read off what you need for meaning, and at some other level, or maybe the same level, you read off what you need for phonology. But semantics and phonology are not themselves they don't themselves have any generative power. They don't have combinatorial rules. They're just what happens at the end of a syntactic derivation. So we hear a lot about how Chomsky's theories have changed over the years in drastic ways, but this assumption remains the same. So I've given you in the handout 3 sample architectures from the history. The first one is the standard theory of aspects, where the phrase structure rules and the lexicon together build deep structure. Deep structure is read off to semantic interpretation. Deep structure also undergoes all the transformations to derive surface structure, which then is fed to the phonology, and then the phonology produces the sound. The 1981 incarnation, government binding theory, again has phrase structure rules, now called X-bar theory, plus the lexicon, creating D structure, which is the new version of deep structure, and he uses D structure so he doesn't imply that it's deep anymore, it's just a structure. And then it undergoes a number of different rules that massage it, called move alpha, which are the counterparts of the transformations. And then, I left out a level here. I left out, those together derive something called S structure. I hope that's, okay. Together they derive S structure, surface structure, and then surface structure is fed in 2 directions. One to something called phonetic form. It's not clear where the traditional phonology fits in this anymore. And the other one undergoes more movement to become something called logical form, or LF, which in turn is read off to semantic interpretation. So again, all of the generativity is in the X-bar theory and the lexicon. We then move to the minimalist program, the newest incarnation, where instead of having any sort of specific phrase structure rules, there is just this general operation of merge, which is stick things together. You stick words together, you draw them out of the lexicon, and you build trees as you go, and you move things as you go. And eventually, at some point in this derivation, it decides to spell it out, and it gets sent off to phonology, where you pronounce it. And then it keeps undergoing more massaging and becomes LF again, which then becomes semantic representation. So again, all of the combinatorial power is in this merge operation, which puts the words together. It's all in the syntax. Now what this means is, if semantics doesn't have any generative power of its own, everything every semantic distinction that you want to make has to somehow be in the syntax, so it can be matched with the sound. That means that the syntax has to carry a lot of semantic weight in it. And if you look at the history of generative grammar in that light, you see that many parts of the grammar are motivated on the grounds of having to support semantic distinctions. So, for example, the level of LF has quantifier scope spelled out as syntactic structure. Well, it never shows up in syntactic structure on the surface. It's just there in the syntax so that the semantics can read quantifier scope off of syntax. Okay? And that was the motivation for LF in the first place. Later on, LF took on all kinds of other functions, but its original motivation was to do quantifier scope. I should say at the beginning, this assumption that syntax does all the generation looked pretty plausible. Because, first of all, the goal was to show that something is generative, and Chomsky showed that abundantly. And to have a mechanism that actually did it looked very good. And at that time, it looked like phonology could be just sort of a last-minute fix-up on surface syntax. So the surface syntax gets all the words in order, and then the phonology sort of massages the ends of words so they fit together properly. And that was basically the approach of Chomsky and Halley's sound pattern of English of 1968. And also at that time, nobody knew anything about semantics, at least within the generative tradition. So everybody is willing to go along with saying, yeah, we read it off the syntax, that's okay. However, during the 1970s, I think that picture changed a great deal. And it's most enlightening to look at phonology first, I think. What happened in phonology in the 1970s was that it began to be realized that phonology has its own kind of autonomous structure. So I have here some phonological structure for the phrase the Big Apple. And if you were at the lecture on Monday, you saw much more of this applied to a bigger sentence. The point being that it has these little trees that give you the syllable structure, and the syllable structure is generative, though not recursive. There's an infinite number of different strings of syllables you can put together. And it has this metrical structure, which is also generative and independent, to some degree independent of the syllable structure. The metrical structure is this grid of beats of varying strengths. And the way people started to think about stress rules, I guess starting from the Lieberman and Prince article of 1977, is that there are principles for forming metrical grids, principles for forming syllabic structures, and then there are association rules that tell you how you can match up well-formed grids with well-formed syllabic strings of syllables. So there are two different generative components plus an interface component that's telling you how to connect them. So the stress rules are not something that's sort of a low-level fix-up on surface syntax anymore, telling you what stress to put on the vowels. It's rather how to match up these two autonomous structures, neither of which is syntactic. At a larger level of phonology, at a level sort of at the size of syntactic constituents, we have a phonological constituent that might be called an intonation contour, an intonational phrase. And what we see is that intonational phrases don't correspond one-to-one with syntax. So I have given you on the next page a sample sentence which I heard a lot of when my children were little. This is uttered at the end of every Sesame Street show, but is uttered by different characters on different days. So one character would say, Sesame Street is a production of, Sesame Street is a production of the Children's Television Workshop. Another character would say, Sesame Street is a production of the Children's Television Workshop. Both associated with the same syntactic structure, no difference in meaning as far as I can tell. They were offering the same information. And what you should notice is that in the prosodic bracketings, I've marked some of these brackets with exclamation points. those are prosodic constituents that don't correspond to syntactic constituents. Okay, so is Sesame Street is a production of? Is that a noun phrase? No. Is it a verb phrase? No. Is it a complete anything? No, because it ends with a preposition and the object of the preposition is in the next constituent. So this is a total non-constituent as far as the syntax is concerned, but it's perfectly well formed as an intonational contour. What this leads us to is a theory of intonational phrases being linked to syntactic structure in some ways, but with some leeway. You can do it in different ways. Another example is the famous right-embedded sentence, "This is the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese." The syntactic structure is this relentless recursive embedding, but the intonation contour is this three-part flat structure. This is the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese, where the first two of those are not syntactic constituents, but they're perfectly fine intonation contours. And it's worth mentioning that Chomsky in Aspects cites this example, and he says, well, this is a performance problem. People don't pronounce it correctly in accordance with its syntactic structure. Well, that's all he could say at the time. But by 1978 or so, we could say, no, it's perfectly well formed. It just has different structures in prosody and syntax. And so they correspond in a non-canonical way. Once we can say, well, phonology and syntax are operating with somewhat different combinatorial structures, we now have an easy way of dealing with things like English contractions, such as I'll. Is I'll as in I will? Is I'll a noun phrase with a verb attached to it? That's kind of odd. Is it an auxiliary verb with a pronoun attached to it? That's also really odd syntactically. But phonologically, it's a word. So what we want to say is this is a mismatch between phonological constituency and syntactic constituency, and we can just do that and say the match between syntax and phonology is not perfect. And contractions are a good case of it, intonation contours are another case of it, and so on. What this gives us is that phonology is a generative system with its own kinds of units, phonological words, syllables, intonation contours, stress grids, and so forth, not made out of noun phrases and verb phrases. What we need to describe it then is a generative system which is not derived from syntax. It has its own sets of units. So we have to view phonology as a generative system, syntax as a generative system, and then there have to be principles that tell us how to link structures in the two systems, interface rules. And notice, though, that this is deeply subversive of syntactocentrism, because it says, here's an independent generative power coming from someplace else, namely phonology. But nobody noticed it at the time. It's kind of curious. I mean, what happened was phonologists said, oh, this is terrific. Let's do this stuff. Let's go our own way and work on stress rules. And it was a wonderful flourishing tradition by the 1980s, early 1980s. Syntacticians were worried about constraints on movement. They didn't care about prosodic constituency. So the two areas sort of went their own separate ways, and nobody noticed that it made a difference. I think that Chomsky might have sort of subconsciously noticed that it made a difference, because I'm told that he fought this new phonology very bitterly at the beginning for a very brief period, and then he just fell completely silent. And if you have read Chomsky's work over the past 20 years, you'll notice there are virtually no references to phonology in it. I have come across one reference to intonation contours in all the things that I've read of his since then. He basically ignores phonology. You know, it's a blind spot for him. Which is curious because he had the world's greatest phonologist in the office next door. You know, that's not... it's hard to understand this as a sort of an intellectual phenomenon, but it seems to me to be a fact that generative syntax has entirely ignored the connection to phonology, and when one talks about phonetic form, PF, within government binding theory, it has nothing to do. It doesn't tell you where the stress rules come in. It doesn't tell you where the morphophonology comes in. And I've tried to ask Chomsky about this and gotten no answer. I mean, I hate to give these kinds of anecdotal things, but there's something going on. Well, what about this interface between phonology and syntax? What we've seen already is that it's not an isomorphism. What's important about it is that there is this leeway. It's kind of dirty. But what we also notice is that this interface doesn't see everything on both sides. So the stress rules, which connect the segmental structure, the syllabic structure, to the metrical grids, don't see the beginning of the syllable. All they care about is the vowel and what follows the vowel in the syllable. The beginning of the syllable is invisible, plays no role in the interface. In between syntax and phonology, there is this basic rule that syntactic linear order and phonological linear order have to match up, but the constituency doesn't have to be exactly the same. On the whole, it's the same. So phonological words are usually syntactic words and vice versa. But we've seen, for example, in the case of I'm, where I and are two different syntactic constituents that don't form a word, but in phonology they do form a word. So there are things that break in that direction. I imagine there are things that break in the other direction that count syntactically as a word, but not phonologically. Maybe even the discontinuous negation in French might be a case. So that's the phonology-syntax connection, and I start there because phonology is really robust. I mean, we know more about phonology than any other kind of structure in the mind, I think. So if there's a result that's established there, I take it to be very strong. We now turn to semantics, where there's a lot more dispute. But let's see what happened in semantics. By 1980, there were, I would say, at least 3 and probably more traditions of semantics in existence. At least formal semantics in the Montague tradition, cognitive grammar in the Lakoff and Langecker tradition. My stuff in conceptual semantics was just beginning. Plus, there were a lot of people in computational linguistics who had various forms of semantic representation that they were using. Roger Schenck, for example, with his, what was it called, conceptual dependency graphs or something like that. And they were all entirely different, but they were all alike in one respect. They were not made out of noun phrases and verb phrases. That is, they were not made out of syntactic units. They were made out of other kinds of units like conceptualized objects, maybe conceptualized events, logical connectives, quantifiers, all kinds of semantic features of various sorts that played no or very little role in syntax. So whatever semantic theory turned out to be correct, of these or any other that's envisioned, the bets are that it should not be like syntax. That is, it has its own generative capacity, and therefore that we also need an interface component between syntax and semantics. It's also become fairly evident, at least to me, but I think to many other people, even in the logical tradition, that there's something like the phonological tiers in semantic structure. A distinction between, at the very least, a distinction between what you might call propositional structure, that is, who's doing what to whom, and information structure, which is in things like topic and focus. So if we take a sentence like, the lion chased the bear, it could be, the lion chased the bear. The lion chased the bear. The lion chased the bear. It was the lion that chased the bear. It was the bear that was chased by the lion. All of these have the same propositional structure, but they differ in what's taken to be the focus of the sentence, what's taken to be the topic, and so forth. So we have these two organizations of semantic structure that are to some degree orthogonal to each other, and different languages have different ways of conveying that mismatch between the structures. So English has a few constructions like the cleft, and it has focal stress and intonation. Many languages have a topicalization, use topicalization like crazy. I guess Tagalog and maybe German, where you put the topic at the front of the sentence and everything else follows suit. They're much more topic-oriented. Typically, case marking is used for propositional relations, but also there are topic cases, like I guess wa in Japanese might be a topic case. So these things are going on simultaneously in the semantics, and they are somehow reduced to a unified structure in syntax. Again, there are parts of syntax that are invisible to semantics. For example, I think nominative and accusative case don't pertain to particular semantic roles. They pertain to particular syntactic roles, subject and object, whereas other case markers, like the instrumental, are more semantic in nature, or the dative even, which is usually a goal or recipient. What else? Subject-verb agreement. Whether a language has subject-verb agreement or not, or exactly how it does it, the semantics doesn't care about that at all, right? That's just a syntactic fact to keep track of who's the subject and who's the object. Where you put the verb in the sentence doesn't matter. You know, if it's like English with the verb after the subject, or like Japanese with the verb at the end, the semantics doesn't care. That's just a fact about the syntax of the language. And the interface has to know where to find the verb, but it's not making a semantic difference. And you can derive it from the semantics, conversely. So this is sort of an answer to the cognitive grammarians who say everything in syntax is coming from semantics. Well, why, what's different in the meaning of Japanese such that the verb goes at the end, That's nothing different in the meaning of Japanese sentences. Japanese speakers don't conceptualize the world differently, and therefore they put the verb at the end. That's just a syntactic fact about Japanese. What about in the other direction? And here's where it's more controversial, maybe. Are there parts of semantics that syntax can't see? And I've listed a couple of cases here, and actually I guess I've spent most of my career working these out. But one example is this terrible mismatch between the illocutionary force of a sentence and its syntactic form. So you can use a declarative sentence word order to make a statement, to ask a question if you stick question intonation on it, to tell a joke, to be sarcastic. You can use a question form to make a request, to give an order, to give a polite order, and on and on and on. That is, the syntactic forms don't match up with the semantic possibilities. Another case that I've looked at in some detail is what's called aspectual coercion. Is this something that's familiar to people? Okay, here's the example. If you say, Bill jumped until the alarm went off. You have to understand that as his continually jumping, and then the alarm goes off, and then he stops. You say, where did the repeated jumping come from in the meaning? Well, if we change the verb, Bill slept until the alarm went off, it doesn't mean he slept over and over and over again until the alarm went off. So it's not, so there's something about the difference between jump and sleep that's making a difference. If we say Bill jumped when the alarm went off, he only jumped once. So there's something in the choice between until and when. The way a lot of people have analyzed this is that until is a temporal expression that semantically sets a bound on something that has been going on over time. So X was going on until time Y. If you put something in for X that already occupies a fixed stretch of time, like jumping, you go up and down and then it's over, then it's possible to interpret it as repeated jumping. And so what the terminology that's used is that the point event, the closed event, is coerced into a process by interpreting it as repeated. Now the question is, do you need something in syntax to signal that, or can that come just from the interaction of the words in the sentence? And there are a lot of arguments around now, I think, that you can do it just with the semantics. So the syntax doesn't care about that sense of repetition at all in English. There are some languages that have an iterative aspect where you have to mark the verb. I think Hungarian is one such language, and American Sign Language is one such language. But in a lot of other languages, you don't. So the idea is, here's a piece of syntax that at least in many languages, a piece of semantics that in many languages is just suppressed. It doesn't appear in syntax at all. Another case is reference transfer. So the classic cases are something like Plato is on the top shelf next to Chomsky, and you're pointing to a bookshelf. Well, you don't mean the person Plato and the person Chomsky, you mean the books by Plato and the books by Chomsky. Where is that sense books coming from? Well, if you try to build it into the syntax, you get into a great deal of difficulty. And I think the best analysis is to say, you're allowed to interpret Plato as book by Plato or picture of Plato or whatever under certain pragmatic conditions. And you can be fairly precise about those, but you don't have to put it into the syntax. Another case of reference transfer is the famous sentence of Jeff Nunberg's, where you have the waitresses in the restaurant, and one waitress says to the other, the ham sandwich over there in the corner wants some coffee. Okay, and it means the person who's eating or who ordered the ham sandwich, something like that. And you know that ham sandwich is not stored in the lexicon as polysemous, meaning both a ham sandwich and a person eating a ham sandwich.
The coffee cannot mean the coffee drinker.
That's right. The coffee cannot mean the coffee drinker. And why would... Well, it could. Oh, no, not wants another coffee. Not one, but you could say the ham sandwich is over there by the coffee, and then it could mean both the ham sandwich eater and the coffee drinker, right? Right? So one can worry about the conditions under which this is possible, but they're certainly not syntactic. So here is an aspect of semantics, again, that you can freely leave out in syntactic structure and get away with it because you can rely on your hearer to reconstruct the intended meaning. And a possible fourth case is quantifier scope, which I mentioned before, so I won't do it again. Now, this then raises the question, if there's an interface between phonology and syntax and one between syntax and semantics, is there one also between phonology and semantics? And it might well be that for this case where you're using just stress to indicate focus, so the bear chased the lion, that could be seen as just a straight interface from phonological prominence to information structure prominence, with no syntactic involvement whatsoever. If you try to do it in a syntactocentric theory, you have to say, well, focus is marked in the syntax, and then it's read off as focus in semantics and stress in phonology. And that's what I did in my 1972 book, because that's what you had to do, you know. But it's really silly. There's this focus feature in the syntax that does no work in syntax at all. It only does work in phonology and semantics. Once we say, well, there are these parallel generative systems that can interface in various ways, we now can get rid of that thing in syntax. So what do we have? We end up with a theory where we have formation rules that are generative in each of the three components, phonology, syntax, and semantics, and interfaces between them, pairwise or maybe even triplet-wise. Is that a word? I don't know. And so you might say, why should I do this? This is a horrible, messy architecture. It's been working so well the way I've been doing grammar. Why should I give that up? And my answer is this. First of all, the idea that the grammar was syntactocentric was always just an assumption. Nobody ever gave an argument for it. I've now given you an argument for the parallel architecture. It's also interesting because it now raises the question, what is the balance of power among all these components? Well, if the syntactocentric theory were right, we could find it out in this architecture, because it would turn out that we wouldn't need any independent phonological formation rules or semantic formation rules. Everything would come from the syntactic formation rules plus the two interfaces. Then we would have the principles and parameters, Y-shaped theory, right? Or it might be that cognitive grammar is right, and we don't need any syntactic formation rules. Everything in syntactic structure comes from meaning via the interfaces. Okay? Or it might be there are other theories around which are variants of this. So, for example, lexical functional grammar, Bresnan's theory, has two different tiers in the syntax, constituent structure and functional structure. Sadok's autolexical syntax has two tiers in syntax, phrase structure and morphological structure. Van Valen's role and reference grammar has the two tiers in semantics of propositional and information structure, and the morphosyntax and phrasal syntax in the syntactic component, and interfaces going every which way. So as variants on this basic approach, we can see a number of different, many of the different trends in generative grammar and its offshoots as variants of this architecture. So it's another reason to adopt this as our fundamental framework and then say, well, what's the balance of power among these components? I should say, actually, there is one theory of grammar that did have this sort of systematic generative power connected by interfaces, and this is Sidney Lamb's stratificational grammar, which was kind of, I can't say it was sort of flourishing, but sort of not flourishing in the late 1960s. I mean, there were people who did it. And I remember when we were graduate students, were you there when he came and gave a lecture?
Yeah, the donut example.
Right? I don't know. He had these, fantastically complicated diagrams. And so we all went back to our offices and wrote spaghetti all over the blackboard, and then we sort of got over it. But there was something right there in the notion that language is composed of this sort of string of levels connected by interfaces, and each level has its own definitional principles. Okay, so that's the parallel architecture. What happens to the lexicon now? Well, remember, in aspects and also in government binding theory and in the middlemost program, words get into sentences by being inserted into syntactic structure. A word, though, is a piece of phonology, a piece of syntax, and a piece of meaning. So syntactic structures carrying around all of these features that don't belong to syntax, only the syntax can't see them. It's as though, I think Ivan Sog thought of this metaphor, it's as though the syntax is carrying around two locked suitcases, which it can't open, and then it gets to phonology and says, here, you take it, and it gets to semantics and says, here, you take it. Yeah? What happens in the parallel architecture? What I don't want to say is that all the words are inserted into syntax. But what is a word? Well, a word being a piece of phonology, a piece of syntax, and a piece of semantics, it's an interface rule. It's a kind of rule. It says one of the principles for connecting phonology to semantics is if you hear this sound, you can impute this piece of meaning. Okay, that's what interface rules do. So what we want to do is to think of lexical items not as being inserted into syntax and then traveling outward to the other components, but rather as being inserted simultaneously into the three structures and giving you the connections among them. That's what it means for a word to be an interface rule. And now, all of a sudden, we can do idioms perfectly straightforwardly. This has always been kind of an embarrassment, I think, in the Chomskyan architectures, where what you insert are X0s, that is, nouns or verbs or adjectives. If you take an idiom like kick the bucket, which sure looks like a VP, where do you insert it? And, you know, Chomsky has had a various, it's always in the footnotes what you do with idioms. But idioms are not a marginal part of the language. I think it was Maurice Gross who first argued that there are, 40,000 idioms in French, something like that. There are at least as many idioms as there are adjectives. So you need a grammar that deals readily with pieces of syntactic structure that are bigger than words, but function the way words do. What you can do in the parallel architecture is say, well, kick the bucket is a VP, and it's connected to phonology in the usual way that a transitive verb phrase is, so it's pronounced kick the bucket, but its interface to the semantics is not one word at a time, like the literal meaning. It's rather the entire verb phrase is connected to the meaning die. And that's perfectly straightforward to state within this framework. And it's very much the way, actually, I think HPSG deals with idioms. Through unification of a piece of structure with the larger syntax in which it's situated. It also gives us a nice treatment of irregular morphology. So the word feet now is regular in the connection between syntax and semantics. Okay, it's a plural noun, but the connection between syntax and phonology is irregular. That is, there are these two pieces, noun and plural, that are connected to one phonological constituent, namely feet. So it's just sort of like idioms, only on the other side of syntax, going from syntax to phonology instead of syntax to meaning. They're idiomatic. Now, the other interesting thing about looking at the lexicon this way as a collection of little rules is that most of the differentiation of words is in phonology and semantics. All the words, dog and kangaroo and aardvark and table and camera are all syntactically the same. They're all count nouns. Maybe in French they fall into two classes, masculine and feminine. Big deal, given their, 20,000 nouns, and there are only, 4 kinds of nouns as far as the syntax cares. Most of the work is done by the phonology and the semantics. And seeing a word then as an interface that's giving you both, that's connecting phonology and semantics with a little bit of syntax to tell you how to order it in the tree, it's now changing the focus of linguistic theory away from generating things out of syntax to really connecting form and meaning. Now, another result of all this is that syntax and semantics, I should say, are liberated from each other. You don't have to put all the semantic information into the tree, into the syntactic tree anymore, as long as it's carried by the semantic parts of the words or the semantic parts of the constructions. You still need syntax. You can't get rid of syntax the way the cognitive grammarians think, because you have to still say where the verb goes and where the cases go and what agrees with what and so forth. There's still syntax there, but it looks as though there's a great deal less of it. And now we can really talk about syntax being autonomous from semantics in the sense that I think was intended in the late 60s. It's getting late. Okay, so you might say, all right, so that's what it does for linguistics, so what? We can keep doing linguistics with or without this. What I want to show you is how this way of looking at grammar helps us connect back with the cognitive sciences. The first thing is that this kind of architecture, I think, fits naturally into what we know about the rest of the mind and or the brain. So if you think about the relationship of acoustic signals to phonetics, it's a dirty interface. The acoustics doesn't map one-to-one into phonetics. For one thing, there are parts of acoustics that the phonetics can't see at all. For example, the speaker's tone of voice, the speaker's voice quality, the speed, the ambient noise in the room, and so on, play no role in mapping to phonetics. And there are things in phonetics that aren't in the speech signal, such as word boundaries. And also going from phonetics to motor control, there's the same kind of dirty connection, because motor control doesn't respect word boundaries. You just sort of talk right through things. That's why it's so hard for me to understand French because I can't pick out the word boundaries. In print, it's much easier. It also, the phonetics is imposed on tone of voice, speed of speech, and so forth. And even then, motor control is not one-to-one mapped to that intended output because I could talk with a pen in my mouth, and the motor instructions are entirely different, and yet the phonetics is intelligible at least, more or less. So we see the same kind of interface from phonetics to the sensory systems and the motor systems that are involved in the communication of language. At the other end, in the visual system, we don't know much about the levels of representation in vision, but what we know about the brain, I think, is that there are a couple of dozen different areas of the brain which are concerned with visual perception and visual understanding, and some of them specialize in movement, some of them specialize in color, some of them specialize in shape, some of them specialize in how you reach them, and so forth, and they all have to talk to each other, presumably by interfaces. None of them contains the whole visual understanding of the scene. It's shared among them. So that looks again like this partialed out story of linguistic structure. And finally, the connection of language to vision seems to me, and there isn't time to work this out here, the connection of linguistic meaning to visual perception also has to involve the same sort of interface. So it looks as though the kinds of connections inside the language faculty are very much like the kinds of connections from language to the rest of the mind and within the rest of the mind. So we have, it seems to me, a much more cognitive looking system in the parallel architecture than the syntactocentric one. A second advantage has to do with the competence-performance distinction. This is something that has been a bone of contention between linguists and everybody else in cognitive science forever. I think initially, if you look at this distinction in aspects, what Chomsky was really trying to do was to say, we want to be able to study things like Bulgarian case marking and Turkish vowel harmony without worrying about the neurons. That's, or worrying about the brain processes that produce these things. So we want to be able to do what linguists have always done, and it's a legitimate way to study language. But he tried to make it look principled. So he said, well, we're going to make this cut between competence and performance so we can ignore all these things that the behaviorists thought language was about, like the coughing in the middle and so forth, and the mistakes, and just talk about the knowledge. And what happened was, early on, there were some experiments that seemed to show that in sentences that took more transformations, they were harder to process. So passive negative sentences were harder to process than active declarative sentences, and so on. And so it looked like, oh, well, transformations are psychologically real. And then those experiments came to be debunked. They didn't, it didn't carry through generally. And by about early 1970s. And so people said, oh, that shows Chomsky is wrong about generative grammar. Transformations have no psychological reality. And Chomsky's response was, oh, I never said that competence had anything to do with performance. So he built a firewall between psycholinguistics and linguistic theory. And that's the way it's stayed ever since, pretty much. Although the psycholinguists borrow from linguistic theory, the linguists spend very little time looking at psycholinguistics. Well, in fact, there's a logical reason why the syntactocentric architecture was not well adapted to studying processing. And that's because it starts with syntax in the middle and proceeds outward in the derivation. And we were always taught to say, well, that's metaphorical. When we talk about this rule applying after that one, we don't mean in real time, it's just a metaphor. but the metaphor is pervasive. It's in the logical structure of the theory. You can't have this distinction available unless it's been generated by something else going on previously, and we put that in quotes, but there's no other way to interpret it. Whereas the logical directionality of perception is from sound to meaning, and the logical directionality of production is from meaning to sound, and the logical directionality of the syntactocentric architecture is neither, or it's partly one and partly the other. The parallel architecture, on the other hand, is stated in a way that's non-directional. That is, one can pass through the interfaces in either direction. It doesn't matter. One can start with a piece of structure in one component and see what constraints it places on the other components. So because it's a constraint-based, sort of unification-based grammar, one can think of clamping a derivation, let's say, at phonology, that is, some stuff comes in from the perceptual system, and now letting the constraints proliferate through the grammar until you get to the meaning, so you understand the sentence. Or you can clamp it at the meaning. There's something you want to say, let the constraints proliferate through to the phonology, and then you have something to say. And part of the constraints proliferating, of course, is to choose words, because the words are constraints on matching the structure. So lexical access now becomes very important. The role of the lexicon in processing is very important. You have to choose the words, and they, in turn, set up structures. You choose words, let's say, in perception based on their phonology, and they set up constraints in the other components. Or in production, you set up words based on the meaning, and those create constraints on what happens in the syntax and phonology. And this is very much like the role of lexical items in the psycholinguistic literature. If you look at any of the stuff on perception or production, it looks very much like what you can do with the parallel architecture. So it looks like we have the beginnings of a connection between the competence theory and the performance theory that's much closer than has existed in 30 years practically, over 30 years in the theory. So that's an advantage. A third one has to do with evolution. If we're claiming universal grammar is a cognitive specialization in people, it has to be carried somewhere in the genetic code, someplace that has emerged in the course of natural selection. But if we want to construct a plausible story, we'd like to say, well, there were stages, it emerged gradually, the way everything else in evolution seems to have emerged gradually. But we can't do that in a syntactocentric architecture. Why not? Because the first thing that would have to emerge so that you could get linguistic structure would be syntax. You couldn't have sound first because that's generated by syntax, and you couldn't have meaning first because that's generated by syntax. Now, if you can imagine hominids evolving a syntactic capacity without any connections to sound and meaning, what good would it do them? You couldn't say anything. You could have all these trees running around in your head. You couldn't say anything with them, and you couldn't mean anything with them. And you couldn't, and because there was no overt signal, nobody could learn them from the environment. Now again, I think Chomsky subconsciously knew that this was a problem, because what has his response been to evolutionary argumentation? He said, natural selection, it stinks. I mean, the arguments for natural selection are not very good. You know, who knows what, my favorite one is, who knows what happens in a collection of 10 to the 10th neurons compressed into the size of a basketball? You know, who knows what unknown physical processes may lead to language? And he's always been very dismissive of arguments for evolution. And he's right, of course. There are other constraints on evolution besides natural selection, such as the biochemistry of proteins and the mechanical possibilities. You know, you couldn't have mammals evolving wheels, for example, because there'd be no path to get there. But still, one would like a plausible story of how the language faculty could have evolved. Now, just about everybody outside of Chomsky thinks that language started as some kind of a vocal signaling system and built on that. well, what's a vocal signaling system? It's a connection between sound and meaning. That, well, we think now, I don't think it was believed so 40 years ago, we now believe that chimps have the system of meaning in place to some degree. They get around in the world the way we do. They have complicated social lives where they do a lot of very delicate manipulation of the social context. And to describe that in terms of a knowledge system requires some sort of a generative computational capacity that we would identify as thought if it were happening in us. So we can say, well, the system of thought was at least to some degree already there. Then what happens? It got linked to sounds more productively than in other primate communication systems. So we would have something like proto-words without any syntax. So it's just duples of form and meaning. Then, as one starts concatenating these, one needs a way to regulate what the semantic relationships among the words are. And that's where syntax comes in last in the evolutionary story, as a way to regulate the connections between form and meaning, so that when you have, let's say, two nouns and a verb, you know which one is the actor and which one is the patient. Those sorts of things are what syntax is great for. So that now, within the parallel architecture, we can say, well, you leave out the syntactic component and you get something that is still a plausible communication system. It's not as great as modern language, but you could do a lot with it. And you could imagine hominids doing that for, 1,000,000 years or something before syntax evolved. So we have, it at least gives us a way of talking, giving a plausibility argument about the evolutionary antecedents of language. And that's a good thing for talking to the rest of the world, because evolutionary psychology is really hot stuff these days. And everybody's worried about the evolutionary antecedents of not only, sexual selection and things like that, but language. Everybody else but the linguist is getting into the evolution of language, and they don't know anything about language. So if we have a story about language that allows us to really straighten this out, that's an advantage, as far as not only in terms of advancing the science, but in terms of securing linguistics a place in the modern cognitive neurosciences. So it seems to me that these kinds of advantages of the parallel architecture, plus having a way to do semantics that's independent of syntax, that these are all reasons to do generative grammar within this framework. It's very hard, I know, to sort of turn your mind around when you're used to doing it within a more standard framework. And to try to do it this way, it's really a challenge. I mean, it's taken me many years to learn how to turn it inside out myself. I have hoped in my recent works, especially Foundations of Language, to try to give an idea of how this might go. But, there have been thousands of linguists working in the old framework on thousands of phenomena. One person alone cannot reconstruct the theory. So what I'm urging you to do is to try this stuff out and see if you like it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think that this parallel perspective is a valuable perspective. I think you slightly misrepresent, but anyway, there's a lot of possible quibbles about what exactly the best characterization of the syntactocentric architecture is. It's not meant to be a sort of neurally relevant. One way to characterize it would be that it's about how you explain certain large classes of phenomena. For instance, how you explain the kind of phonological phenomena you find, and explain, for instance, there's a sort of an implicit prediction of major asymmetries in the dependency relations, for instance, between syntax and phonology, or between syntax and semantics, if you think all semantics is done from surface structure. And one thing that seems obvious is that it works a lot better to say phonology only has to look at surface syntax than to say that semantics only has to look at surface syntax, okay? So there seems to be a big asymmetry there, and half of it is predicted by a sort of the general Chomskyan architecture. If you take it one way, don't take it the way. I don't see that there's any more of a prediction from Chomsky's architecture or Breslin's or anyone else that you can't have syllable structure and things like that in phonology. They just don't care much about it. They don't say anything about that. But they do make a clear prediction, I think, that you should expect. They're very happy to find, for instance, trace influences on constraints going from a surface syntactic structure, for instance, on pronunciation. And I think they're very happy to find, if they think that phonological interpretation is done on surface structure, that there's no facts at all that seem to motivate either doing phonology on deep structure and not on surface structure, or doing syntax or some syntactic rule that depends on some phonological operation. The only conceivable case for me is heaviness, but that's arguably not at all a case where syntax depends on phonology. So let me just stop there.
It's arguable.
Well, it's arguable, but I think the debate has always been carried out in the framework of assuming that syntax is driving phonology. I think a case could be made more on the basis of the independence of the two and the mismatches between the two. So especially in morphology and morphophonology, and the connection between morphosyntax and morphophonology, there are huge numbers of mismatches that have been terrible problems, I think, for morphologists, because they're assuming that the syntax has to carry the information that is going to now be relevant for the phonology, rather than saying, well, there's this kind of rough correspondence, things have to be in the right linear order, but the constituency could be different. And I think what's beyond that, I think what is new here is saying we do have to look at the structure of the whole grammar. We can't just look at the structure of syntax alone and make assumptions about what's on the other sides of the interfaces. We have to look at how those connect. And I think probably the more drastic results are in the syntax-semantics connection rather than syntax-phonology. But with, I think that the Chomskyan syntax has taken the approach of, well, especially in the minimalist program now, he said, well, we want to assume that language is the perfect mapping between the interfaces. And you say, well, what's on the other side of the interfaces that it's mapping from and mapping to? And he never tells you. And, I've tried, again, personal experience, I've tried to engage him on this issue, and he just won't bite. And he says, we don't know anything about the other side, and we can best find out just by looking at language. Whereas I'm saying, especially at the phonetic end, we know tremendous amounts about the interface, what's on the other side. Maybe not on the meaning end, that's the hard one. But certainly, if we take our message from acoustic phonetics and articulatory phonetics and how those are connected to perception, we know a lot about what's on the other side, and we should be using that as evidence for what the language faculty is like. Also, I think in this assumption that this is a major philosophical difference, I guess, between me and Chomsky. Chomsky actually recently has made this contrast between the Galilean view of science, that things are simple and perfect, and who is it? Is it? No, not Skinner. It isn't Francois Jacob, is it? Nature as a tinkerer, evolution as a tinkerer, right? Or Minsky, evolution as an engineer, where things are messy and they're put together, helter-skelter until it works okay, And he really doesn't think language is like that. And I do, I guess. I mean, reluctantly, I would like it to be Galilean, but on the other hand, everything else that's a product of evolution has this tinkering quality about it. You can't just sort of design something from scratch. You have to get there from what you had before. And my inclination is to think that a lot of language is like that as well. And so that's a really major difference in philosophy. So the kind of minimalism that I would prefer is not one where there are minimal, elegant principles, but rather minimal structure. I mean, language does the most it can to connect sound and meaning with the least structure, and if it takes lots of rules to do that, and some of them are messy, so what? After all, there are 50,000 or 80,000 words in the language, and those are all rules, and you learn all of those. What is 500 rules of syntax? What's the big deal? You know, that's sort of my view of syntax, which is, again, quite against the grain of Chomsky's thinking. I think it's more in tune with what people like Adele Goldberg in construction grammar is thinking. And maybe even I shudder to think Tomasello might be thinking along those lines. You can still do, that doesn't make it chaotic. I mean, there's still right and wrong answers about things. You can tell when you have the right analysis, but your criteria have to be somewhat different, I think. I've talked enough. Another question.
Yeah, I think I like your stuff, and I'm ready to work along these lines, provided that you answer one or two more questions. You yourself pointed out that Van Valen made a comparable proposition. Mm-hmm. He also has 4 components in his grammar. Mm-hmm. But one which you don't have, what he calls the functional projection. So if we want to be ecumenist, we take your 4 components and add Van Valen's functional projection. This makes 5. Also Sadok has a morphophonological component. So ecumenistic again, we take the 5 previous ones plus this one from Sadok, it makes 6. So why in the end should we have 4 or 5 or 6?
Yes.
And so there are some categoricity between those.
Mm-hmm.
The decision to make a precise number of components, what reasons do we have to make one design rather than another one?
In the sense that phonology now has this heterogeneous set of components, the one for syllabic structure, one for stress, one for intonation, and their connections among them. So the intonation one is like the Pierre Humbert story, right? Or where there's a family of intonation contours and principles for assigning them. And after a while, if you work in these, this framework, things sort themselves out, I hope. I think Van Valen's, I'm trying to remember, you'll have to remind me, Van Valen's functional projection is within the syntax or within the semantics?
The 4 components of Van Valen's are constituent projection, which I interpret as syntax mostly.
Yes.
Second, functional projection,
Mm-hmm.
grammatical functions. Third, logical structure, which is semantics.
Mm-hmm.
And last, pragmatic projection.
Right.
These are
Okay, so the pragmatics is sort of like my information structure. I am beginning to think reluctantly that there is a small little component in syntax that corresponds to that is dealing with subjects and objects, and maybe indirect objects. It's what relational grammar was all about. It's what the part of Bresnan's functional structure that does the work, namely the part with the direct and indirect, subjects and objects again. The obliques play no role in her system. With its structural case, in abstract case in principles and parameters, and it's this structure in Van Valen. I had hoped you wouldn't need those. And I'm reluctantly coming to the conclusion that there is a little subsystem that deals with the innermost syntactic arguments that is different from the part that deals with the adjuncts. And I'm very sad to say that, because I had hoped you could get a direct mapping. But I think you do need this extra. You cannot live without this system in order to do precisely the things that were done by a movement in government and binding, the passive and raising.
Okay. I have a very short complementary question. We haven't heard anything about language change and speaker variation. Is there or is there not a claim in your theory that to say something about that?
I think it's the same as every other generative theory would say. That is that although we normally idealize to a homogeneous speech community, blah, 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 we recognize when we need to that there are differences among speakers and that language contact creates clashes among grammars, and that language learners, of course, have different grammars than adults. And all of that can be accommodated within this system, the same as it was within traditional generative grammar. I don't think I have anything different to say about it.
I had a question. I like the thesis very much, but I didn't expect it from you, because if I correctly remember, in your classical work, you were saying that there was a kind of a strong homomorphism between syntax and semantics, and especially for constituent structure, with the only exception of the specifier becoming an internal argument, yes, and so on. So I just wanted to know if you got rid of this now, and if it was completely wrong, or if you are able to make consistent synthesis between your classical view about semantics being computational, being a kind of language and thought, and being quite homomorphic to English, for instance, or if you consider that all this is old work and is no longer valid.
Good question. I mean, language should reflect the syntactic structure, should reflect the structure of meaning insofar as possible, and I was using that to derive theories about meaning. Having grounded that theory of meaning, then in my 1990 book, I started finding exceptions where it didn't work. There was the whole set of 3 chapters on adjuncts, okay, where I said, here are parts of syntax which don't correspond to semantics the way they should. And I started to get into this construction grammar view on the resultatives and the way construction. Bill belched his way into the restaurant. You know, these things that are very language specific and sort of constructional idioms. And then I started finding things like aspectual coercion and the reference transfers. And so having grounded the semantics in a rather strong canonical predicate argument structure, which by default maps into syntax, I was now able to see all the patterns in syntax that don't correspond to that, which are the things that vary more radically from language to language. I think the existence of these constructions, how one uses reference transfers, and so on. So it's I think my present view is an outgrowth of that view. The default is that there is a correspondence of embedding between syntax and semantics. The semantic functions correspond to syntactic heads. The semantic arguments correspond to complements in syntax. The modifiers in semantics correspond to adjuncts in syntax. That's the default, and that's the position of 1983. But now there are all these other funny things that are laid over that I'm beginning to understand more clearly. Does that help?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about he John belched his way through the restaurant, but think about hit the road. There are 3 reasons why you just can't have a rule saying it means left, that John hit the road. That you need to interpret it as it is and then go back. One reason is if you translate it as left, you don't understand why these idioms are funny. And when something is funny, it comes from a contrast, they say, between what you expect and what you get. And somehow it gets resolved. So that means you're really going to translate it twice. The second reason you can't say hit the road means left is that, as Everaert has pointed out, in languages with alternating auxiliaries, you don't use be. You use be for left, but have for hit the road, or in Dutch, made a landing, you use have, whereas landed uses be. And the third reason is that you just can't have any old idiom. The ones that I studied are the ones Everaert talked about. I mean, to leave, John washed himself is not going to mean leave. So you have to explain, and I think that there is a metalinguistic interface component of idioms, which kind of instructs you on what can be an idiom. You have to change something in the lexical entry. And the reason that's funny is that you can't change anything in a lexical entry. So that having an idiom shows you kind of the makeup of your event structure, how you're supposed to change it to get the idiomatic reading. I mean, if you want to explain why John washed himself doesn't mean John left and John hit the road does mean John left, there's a certain generality. So I think that's kind of built into the system, and that requires that you go through the thing twice, that you really have him hitting the road, and then you go back and you do something that you really can't do for lexical integrity. You change it, and that's what makes it funny, because you're doing something, you have a freedom that as a speaker you can't do. You can't change lexical entries.
I think
Hold on.
now
Because it's not what you expect. What you get is not what you expect.
what I don't remember is the results in the psycholinguistics of idioms. People like Kachari and Gibbs, where they're trying to see whether you're accessing both the literal meaning and the idiomatic meaning, and what you prime with and all those things. I don't remember how that stuff comes out, but as I recall, it's roughly that it doesn't take longer to get the idiomatic meaning than the literal meaning. That is, those are, as one would expect from a sort of Tannenhaus perspective on lexical access, you're accessing the idiomatic meaning as soon as it's possible to do so, not sort of rejecting it and saying it doesn't make sense first. However, you are also accessing the literal meaning, and that is going to influence what happens. And the fact that they're a product of historical development usually means that there's going to be some semantic parallels going on. And I guess the overall point is, whatever you say about the meaning of idioms, in a parallel architecture, it's easy to get them in there. In a syntactocentric architecture, it's not. You can't say idioms are just like other lexical items, except they're bigger pieces of structure. We can also, for example, in the parallel architecture, carry along another tier in the semantics that might be called register. So if you use an idiom that is, let's say, slang, the register has to match up. It's sort of like vowel harmony. You have to have register harmony in your semantics, and that's something that's absolutely natural to code up. I haven't tried to do it, but you can see how it would work. So I think you're quite right about the facts of idioms, that there are funny things going on, and they retain elements of meaning that come from the words that they're derived from, and so on. And I think that's actually evidence in my favor. That is, that's what's funny. I mean, I think the parallel architecture and the parallel, and especially the treatment of the lexicon, give you a way of stating those facts rather than saying, well, you go through the derivation and now we do something that isn't part of the language system. We change the meaning, I'd like to take an approach where, given that how many idioms there are, I would like to say those work just like everything else in the language, only they happen to be bigger in syntax. Pierre.
On the argument based on the fact that there may be a different prosodic bracketing from the syntactic bracketing. So, of course, you have to, for this to be used as an argument in favor of the generativity of the phonological component. It has to be the case that the prosodic bracketing that's distinct from the syntactic one is not parasitic. That is, that the way the phonological processor actually processes, that the component processes that prosodic bracketing distinct from the syntactic bracketing, that there is no priority of the prosodic bracketing that coincides with the syntactic one. So the question is, do you actually have evidence, so to go back to your example, that the prosodic bracketing that does not coincide with the syntactic one, Sesame Street is a production of, the children's television workshop, that the understanding or the processing of that bracketing does not, in a way, in some sense, rely on the, say, orthodox, the one that coincides with the syntactic bracketing, in the sense in which the semantic component can, say, understand in some sense, say things like the bottle is sad, but that's, I mean, one can provide some kind of bizarre interpretation, but that's parasitic on some non-deviant semantic interpretation, or say the way, perhaps the syntactic component can actually process things like he don't like it, or I doesn't like it, or I mean. So okay. So my question really is: do you have actual empirical evidence that the prosodic bracketing that's not the same as the syntactic one is on a par? I mean, is just equally processed as the one that coincides with the syntactic bracketing?
It's a little. I'm not quite sure how to make the argument. I mean, the prosodic bracketing is actually more perceptually evident than the syntactic bracketing, right? It has some of its own. It plays a role in parsing the sentence, of course, but it has some of its own desiderata. It wants to be rhythmic. It wants to be not too. It doesn't want the contours to be too long. It would like the contours to be preferably of equal length, I think. That's why the best prosodic bracketing for the cat one is this is the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese. It's very nice and rhythmic, as opposed to this is the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese, or something like that. That is, the prosodic bracketing is really a rhythmic sort of component. It's connected to the syntax, I think, roughly. I've tried to state this principle a number of times. It's basically the left-hand edge of the beginning of a prosodic constituent corresponds to a syntactic constituent, but the prosodic constituent can end somewhere inside of that constituent.
Bill says the opposite, actually.
Does he? Okay.
I mean, it's the ends that are important, so
Yeah.
he says that almost always you can predict where a possible clause in a prosodic
Yeah.
end boundary is on the basis of the end, not of the whole clause, but of some important constituent within the clause.
Right.
And then there's the problem of criticizing elements like of and things like that.
Yeah, I'm
So
not.
it's basically got a very syntax-dependent.
Yeah, I think that's probably not right, but that could be argued. I mean, that's one of the things that you have to work out, and I think what's interesting is that this way of formulating the problem gives you the liberty to say, well, I don't have to find a derivation, I just have to find this non-isomorphic mapping. And it might turn out to be very constrained, it might turn out to be very free, but usually the inquiry is carried out in a syntactocentric framework, so you have to say, what syntactic boundaries do I delete in order to get the intonation to come out right? Again, this is an issue that I think has to be explored.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned several fields in which people became interested in generative grammars. You didn't mention music that you know very well because you dedicated a book in '87 in the generative theory of tonal music. I'm just curious to see if you changed your position from the thesis that you proposed in '87, and if there is a place maybe for a kind of generative theory of music in this new framework of parallel generative grammars.
Actually, the architecture, because we had 4 independent generative components linked by interface rules. We didn't exactly partial it out. That isn't the way we wrote the rules, but we did have the 4 structures, if you remember that work at all. So I think actually the generative music theory was a major impetus in trying out this way of doing language. I have not done any serious work on music for, close to 20 years, so I haven't changed my views very much. Laerdal has published a book that amplifies some of our work in very important ways. A lot of it is more complex music theory than I can understand myself. But you know, there is a. You're quite right. I forgot about music and Leonard Bernstein and all that. And that was again the early '70s, 1973. Well, I think that's all I need to say about that.
Okay, my question concerns your arguments against the central role of syntax were in fact arguments in favor of the generative capacity of the phonological component and on semantics on the other hand. But are there any clear examples of syntax seeing something in the semantics? I'm not convinced, and I have evidence. Yes, I mean, you showed that there are things that are in the semantics that are invisible for the syntax. My question is, are there things that are in the semantics that are really visible for syntax? I can give an example where it's clear that this is not the case. A situation that one can describe in English by one sings, can be described in some other languages by a completely different syntactic configuration, which is it is sung or something like that. So, to my mind, one can account for the syntax-semantics interface. The syntax sometimes matters for semantics, but I doubt things are the other way.
I think what your example points up is that the syntax-semantics interface is language specific. It's not universal. And so children have to learn, if you mean this, how do you say it in this language? What universal grammar gives you is a variety of options, which are built around some of the defaults that I spoke about earlier. I mean, I think universally you'll find that the head of a phrase corresponds to a semantic function and the complements correspond to the arguments. And then there will be other possibilities. How you're forced to express arguments or allowed to omit arguments depends partly on the language. So there are languages where you can, let's say so-called pro-drop languages, where you can leave out an argument if it's going to be in the subject position and it's pronominal. There are other languages where no pronominal argument needs to be expressed at all, I guess Japanese or Korean. And then there are, some languages like English, I guess French, where different verbs tell you whether you can leave out an argument or not. And those things are all part of language learning. They're not universal, but I think the framework in which they are stated is universal.
But then again, what would be an example where the syntax is sensitive, it takes into account semantic information, really? I mean, for me, syntax just works autonomously, and then we interpret it. And from your example, from whatever you said, I think that is not, that stands.
Well, think about it from the point of view of the producer rather than the interpreter. Okay, you have something you want to say. Okay, you pick out some words you want to use, and now you have to use the syntax to tell you what order to put those words in, and if something happens to be in the subject, then how that has to agree with the verb, and if there's gender agreement, and all those things. Okay, so that the semantics, going from semantics to syntax, it's going to tell you which ones are the verbs, which ones are the complements, which ones are the tense, which ones are the quantifiers. If you're using some idiom, if the lexical item you pick out is an idiom that happens to be a verb phrase, it'll say, well, you've used up the verb, you can't use another verb. So that it won't tell you what order you have to put the verb in with respect to the object, because that's syntax's business, not the interface's business. Although, it might tell you if you want something to be focus, it has to be last. If you're in a free word order language, or if you want something to be topic, it has to be first in a topic language. So there are many, many different kinds of interaction, which you can read either from syntax telling semantics how these pieces are put together, or semantics telling syntax what order to put things in so that it can be interpreted by the hearer to mean that. I mean, I see it completely as bidirectional, and our job within this framework is to say how much of the power of what we have always called grammar now belongs to syntax proper, and what part belongs to the interface, and what part belongs really to semantics and the interface doesn't even know about it. Within the traditional architecture, we always have to say, how do we build this into syntax? Here's a distinction of meaning that doesn't apparently show up in syntax, so we'll have to invoke covert movement in order to build this constituent in the semantics, in the syntax, so that it's there for the semantics. Now we don't have to do those things, and that's what I think is the virtue of this approach in simplifying the syntax. And you're quite right, a lot of the power now goes into the interface. And it's, it's an empirical problem to see how these things work out. And, I've worked out some of them, but there are thousands of other things in thousands of languages to try. Yeah? Oh, one more time.
Just one. The kind of example that I would have liked to have is the parallel to what you said about the phonological, phonological component being relevant for syntax. That is the height, weight stuff, and not, of course, processing. But
Well, I think, very simply, what turns out to be the subject depends on its semantic role, right? I mean, if there are two semantic roles and one is an agent and one is a patient, the interface will say the agent is going to be the subject, unless we're in a passive and then things funny happen, right? Yeah. Yes. All right.
This is more a sociological question. Does he even care? Does he treat it with contempt, or does he see that there's really something to reply to?
I was speaking to Dan. I cannot get Chomsky to engage this material at all. When I started moving along these lines, I sent him versions of a paper that then grew into the architecture of the language faculty. And for the first time, he never sent me a reply. And it was a very nice paper. It did not insult him or anything. But he never replied. And I sent it to him again, and he never replied. So my assumption is he hates it. And he's trying to deal with it. If we want to be sociological, he deals with it the way he deals with things he doesn't like. Namely, he just wipes them out, the way he's wiped out phonology.
I don't know how to say this clearly. It seems to me that the syntactic theory is a kind of coherent whole, whereas certainly there are partial semantic structures, but they don't hold together. I'm thinking, like, as an example of Fauconnier, examples like even Hercules can't lift this rock. And certainly we have scales in our mind, and the syntax, even Hercules can't, is a trigger entering into a mental calculation saying, well, if Hercules can and he's extreme, then nobody can. That's like with one semantic structure. I can't see being connected with other semantic structures like spatial displacement, the kind of things that you do, or let's say inclusion. Inclusion exists, and prepositions are used for it. And this inclusion structure is used for spatial inclusion, but it's also used for possession. It's also used for inalienable possession. It's also used for sight verbs. So I don't see, I mean, there certainly are another semantic structure is linear time, but all these things don't seem to me to be connected. They are triggered by different things in the syntax which are connected by the tree structure, but the semantic structures which do exist seem to me to lack connection between them.
Well, that's partly because there are two reasons. One is I think semantics is much more complicated and much richer and multidimensional than syntax. And the role of syntax is to smash all this stuff into a linear structure so that phonology can pronounce it. So we should expect syntax to be tremendously impoverished with respect to semantics. As far as how these things are all connected, I think the problem is that just as there are practitioners of morphology who don't connect with practitioners of phrasal syntax, all the practitioners of semantics are divided into little camps who work on different things, and nobody ever tries to say, what is a unified semantic structure for such and such a sentence? The notion of scales, of course, is, if you take my old line based on Gruber or Lakoff's line or whatever, it's spatial location. A scale is a linear space, and you're locating something on it. So even is telling you about a location in a space, a property space of degree or something like that. Now, how that integrates with lifting the rock, who knows? I think the challenge is to work that stuff out. That's, to me, the interesting stuff in semantics, to figure out how all the pieces interlock. Speaking of syntax, what the hell part of speech is even anyway? I mean, we don't know what it is in syntax, right? So, it's not a standard category, and it attaches to all kinds of different categories, and if you can call it a functional projection, but that's not answering anything. So I think all these observations are valid, and I think they're just spurs to doing future work. Thank you. Hello again. Today I'm going to talk about something that I've been thinking about sort of on the side for about 15 years, an approach to a theory of social cognition from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience. The only writing of mine that you may have come across on this was a very small paper in the book Languages of the Mind, and the final chapter of my so-called pop linguistics book, Patterns in the Mind. But I've written a couple of technical papers. There's a paper on rights and obligations that came out in a volume whose name I forget, edited by me and Paul Bloom and Karen Wynn. And when I started thinking about this, it was really very much off the deep end. I mean, nobody was thinking in this area at all. But since then, it seems that there is beginning to be a community of people who are interested in different aspects of it. I have not seen anybody proposing this whole program that I'd like to propose, but we can see where various research programs that are now in existence can play a role in this enterprise. So I'm going to try again to sort of state the agenda for this overall area of inquiry. So what do I mean by social cognition in this perspective? I take it to be the domain of cognitive neuroscience that pertains to a certain subject matter in the organism's repertoire, namely social interaction. And what do I mean by social interaction? It means the organism's ability to deal with conspecifics, to deal with other members of its species, as well as the organism's grasp of interactions among other conspecifics, not just one's own interactions. And adding to this, I want to say this is in the context of larger social institutions, and you'll see what this means as we go along. And I think this definition can be applied not only to humans, but also to animal societies, all the way from chimps down to maybe ants. Now, in order for an organism to be able to use a capacity for social cognition, it has to be able to perceive the environment and act in it. But I'm going to propose that a theory of social cognition can abstract away from many of the problems of basic perception and motor control and concentrate on phenomena that are more strictly of social significance. We do see social significance in the perceptual systems when we study phenomena like face perception, tracking eye gaze, recognition of affect or emotion through facial expression, gesture, and posture. All of these fall under a field that is often called person perception. And motor control plays a role when we think about the production of signals such as facial expressions and communicative calls. And these are all fascinating phenomena in their own right, and they certainly do deserve all the study they're getting. And of course, even Darwin thought about these matters. It goes way back. But I'd like to think more about what purposes, what deeper purposes these perceptual and motor phenomena serve. What non-perceivable systems of cognitive organization make things like face perception and affect perception and the production of signals crucial to the organism. Why should the organism care what somebody else's face looks like? Now, in the case of most animals, from what I can gather, social organization is essentially fixed across the species, with, of course, variation from species to species. In each primate species, there appears to be a limited amount of variation from one population to another. On the other hand, in the human case, of course, there's a vast range of variation in social behavior and social organization among populations, and we call these differences culture. So, given these differences, children born into a particular culture have to learn that culture's pattern of social interactions on the basis of cues provided in the environment by other people, whether these cues are provided consciously or unconsciously. Well, this begins to sound like linguistics. The problem of how a child acquires social and cultural competence is a lot like the problem of language acquisition that was set forth by Chomsky about 40 years ago. And of course, as I said last week, this is the problem that's still at the center of linguistic theory. So I want to review this problem in a minute and a half and then show the analogy to social cognition. Have the handouts arrived?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay, so for language, humans manage to create and understand an unlimited number of utterances of their language, most of which they've never heard before. And this ability, therefore, requires a combinatorial system or a grammar in the language user's mind, which allows linguistic structures to be built up from some finite stock of learned elements that are stored in memory. And this grammar is not available to consciousness, only the output, namely the sentences, are available in the sense that I talked about last week also. The child has to acquire this system of the stock of rules, the lexicon, the stock of elements to combine, and the rules. The child has no direct evidence for the grammar, only the output is available. So learning has to involve the active creation of organization in the mind of the learner, and it may or may not, usually in the case of language, it doesn't involve much teaching on the part of those with whom the learner interacts. So in order to use the speech in the environment as evidence for the grammar, the child has to bring to bear the inner resources of the mind, and since these resources are by definition not learned, they're the things that the child uses in order to learn, they have to be a consequence of the inherent structure of the human brain, which is determined by the interaction of the genome with biological development. Some of these inner resources may be cognitive specializations for language, others may be more general purpose, and it may be possible that part of our goal is to sort these out. So let's see how this carries over to social cognition. We can state an almost parallel sequence of problems. Humans manage to participate and understand an unlimited number of social interactions, most of which they've never encountered before, exactly. The ability to interact socially, therefore, by the same argument, has to involve a combinatorial system of principles in each individual's mind, which makes it possible to build up understandings of particular situations from some stock of stored elements. Maybe in the case of social interaction, the principles are not as unconscious as they are in language. We may know what some of them are, but there probably are lots of principles that are not conscious either, so we haven't even started to look for them. And so the child has to learn this system of principles in the course of being socialized. The child only has partial evidence for this system. Only the output, actual social behavior, is available. So the child must actively create organization in its mind, probably unconsciously. There may be some teaching in the case of social interaction that there is not in the case of language. And so we can ask what inner resources the child brings to bear on learning social interaction in the culture. And some of these these have to be determined by the genome, and some of them may be a cognitive specialization for social interaction, and some of them may be general purpose. And we ought to be able to figure those out. So it's the very same argument. Let's see how far we can get with it. If we take this argument seriously, we can bring every aspect of cognitive neuroscience to bear on the problem of social cognition. We can study the characteristics of social cultural behavior and look for universals of human culture. This is the counterpart of studying grammars of languages. We can ask about the neurological and genetic basis of social cognition, the counterpart of neurolinguistics. We can ask about the cognitive processes involved. This is the counterpart of psycholinguistics. We can ask about the course of the child's social development and the consequences of various brain deficits for social cognition. So all the angles that are available for looking at language are also possible in social cognition if we start looking. Now, in the case of social cognition, I think we have one more line of evidence that's not available for language that makes it more interesting, namely comparative ethology. Primate societies are highly structured, and they vary somewhat from species to species. This suggests that there's a strong innate genetic basis to their social organization. And much of primate social behavior looks rather familiar to us. They deal in terms of group membership and dominance and sexual selection, issues that look very familiar. And as Darwin already suggested, maybe behind human culture there's a firm foundation of primate evolutionary ancestry. So we ought to be able to use standard comparative methods about the ancestral great ape social repertoire and ask what evolution had to add to that repertoire to get not us on one hand, and on the other hand modern chimps and bonobos and gorillas. So the issue of the evolution of social cognition is not, as Tooby and Cosmides sometimes put it, to think about the environment in which hominids lived in the Pleistocene 2 million years ago. It actually goes back to what ancestral primates and before them what mammals faced, giving solutions for cognition on which the hominids built. Now, I should say right away that this cognitive, biological, and evolutionary approach is not the predominant way that culture is studied. At least in America, anthropology and sociology, the main fields that study culture, are dominated by the view that humans are totally a product of their culture, and that we should not be seeking ways in which culture is the way it is because of human... What did I write? Yeah, we shouldn't be looking at culture in terms of the way humans are. We should be only looking at the way humans are because of culture. So culture is somehow out there creating us, but we have nothing to do with it. This doesn't explain why the dogs and cats that live with us don't share our culture. There's something different between humans on one hand and dogs and cats on the other that must have something to do with our minds, and partly that's what we're looking for. Now, in some cases, there were good reasons for these attitudes, that everything is a product of culture and culture is infinitely variable. For instance, in the early part of the 20th century, Franz Boas, who was one of the fathers of American anthropology, fought very hard for cultural relativism, and he passed on this position to his students Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, among others. And he did this in reaction to a very pervasive view of the time, which was held even by Darwin, that there were inherent differences in intelligence and moral capacities among the races. And so he was on the correct side politically, but scientifically he was somewhat wrong. Too bad. But it's one thing to assert that technological development and military prowess are a consequence of cultural differences rather than inherent intelligence, which is sort of the old-time, let's say, late 19th century view. Humboldt, for example, I think Darwin. And this has been argued against, I think, most eloquently by Jared Diamond in a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he's arguing that all of the differences in technology and civilization are a product of the ecological environment, what animals happen and plants happen to be living around there that you could domesticate, basically, and that there's no inherent differences in human intelligence that lead to that. It's another thing to, even if there are environmental influences on culture and civilization, that doesn't mean that there are no aspects of human cultural capacity that have an inherited basis, that there's no inherent human nature of relevance to the social sciences. And of course the distinction is, are we looking for the species' particular cultural capacity, which is what I'm pushing for, or are we looking for race-specific cultural and moral capacity, which is what Darwin and Humboldt and the rest of the 19th century people were looking for. I think that can be discarded right away. In other words, to return to the main point after this little diversion into politics, descriptive anthropology does have a great deal to offer us in terms of data about social behavior and social organization, but a theory of social cognition becomes quite different when you take seriously the cognitive capacity that must lie behind the overt phenomena that they study. Now, of course, I'm a linguist, so I have a particular angle on how I think this should be studied. I'm most interested in social cognition from a formal or functional point of view, rather than from a brain point of view. As I said the other day, at our present stage of understanding the brain, we may be able to localize some linguistic or social function. Maybe we'll find face recognition in the right parietal lobe, or some kind of moral inhibition in the prefrontal lobe, somewhere on the right. I don't know. Or we may be able to find a neurotransmitter that enhances aggression or affiliative behavior, and find out where it works in the brain. But figuring out how the whole system works is probably pursued at a level of abstraction that's somewhat distant from the neurons. Again, I see this as analogous to the study of language. We know a fair amount about localization of different aspects of language function in the brain, although people are still fighting about it. But for the moment, I think it's fair to say that it'll be a long time before we understand how the details of Bulgarian case marking and Mandarin tone in language, or the notion of ownership, let's say, in social cognition, how these are instantiated in the neurons, how the neurons do it. So for the moment, it seems more fruitful to look at these problems from the perspective of an abstract structural grammar or an internal logic, and put off the issues of neural instantiation for a while. This is not to say we shouldn't be doing neuroscience. There's lots to be learned there as well, but I think the two efforts ought to run in parallel. One should not preclude the other. Okay, so where is social cognition in the sort of ecology of the mind? I would like to think of social cognition as one of the central systems of cognition, running alongside the understanding of physical space. as the other major system. The physical domain involves concepts of physical objects which are located in a three-dimensional isotropic space. That means it's the same in every direction. And objects which move in this space and exert forces on one another. Among the physical objects are natural objects like rocks and trees and rivers, functional objects with affordances for use like bicycles and tables, and animate objects like ants and worms and rats and tigers. Those are not social objects. The animates, though, are conceptualized as capable of unpredictable self-initiated motion, that is volition, and maybe we conceptualize them as having desires and intentions as well. The social domain, on the other hand, at its very purest, consists of persons, that is, individuals with whom we can have social relations, and the social domain encodes the relations and actions among persons as persons. Like all concepts, the concept of person has a certain amount of leakage at the boundaries. Your pet probably counts as a sort of a person, but it doesn't mean that all animals are persons. The mosquito that's buzzing in your ear certainly doesn't count as a person, even though it's animate. And in the other direction of leakage, a very common social tactic for endorsing ruthless behavior towards another group is to characterize them as animals, that is, not persons, and hence not qualifying for social relations. And this is, the typical attitude that one is advised to take in war towards the enemy, right? They're animals, they're pigs, they're dogs, whatever. Now, the social domain is not an isotropic space. In physical space, between any two objects that are not touching, there's an intermediate range in space that can be a region that can be occupied by another object. This notion makes no sense in social space. There are no intermediate spaces between people. To the extent that there's a notion of distance, it's probably something like social distance that's measured in terms of divisions of kinship or class or status or group membership or degree of intimacy or alliance. Now, there are notions of force and coercion and constraint in the social domain, and they're sometimes connected with physical force, but sometimes not. People are conceptualized as occupying both the physical and the social domains, and I think this is the duality signified by the traditional division between the body and the soul, or the body and the mind. And we can demonstrate that these aspects of the person are conceptualized separately by noticing there's a culturally universal belief in entities such as spirits and ghosts and gods and souls that survive death. These are persons who lack definite physical bodies and who exist only in the social domain. These beings have social relations with people and with each other, and so they do exist in the social domain even if not in the physical. Notice also, we have no trouble conceptualizing persons coming to inhabit different bodies through reincarnation, or metamorphosis, a la Kafka, or body switching, as happens in the movies now and then, right? Somebody wakes up and finds themselves in a different body. In each case, the personal identity that is in the social domain is thought of being preserved despite the radical physical change. Another kind of argument for the duality and separation of these two domains is the extreme difficulty that people have in accepting and reasoning within a materialist philosophy of mind in terms of thinking of persons as only physical objects. People really hate this, right? You try to convince your students and they will not buy. At the end of a semester, they still jump right back into believing in the soul. Similarly, people show extreme discomfort with notions like golems and humanoid computers and so forth. These are physical objects which suddenly sprout social identity or personhood. That is, conceptually, if you put all these things together, conceptually, there's a transcendental difference between the physical and the personal. This difference is virtually impossible to erase in our conceptualization of the world. Now, actions on the social plane are on their own unobservable. They become observable only through their linkage with the physical plane. So some physical actions like eating and walking make sense on their own, but other physical actions like shaking hands and performing religious ceremonies make sense only as instantiations or symbols of actions on the social plane. People's choices of costume or speech style can be used to signify social roles, but those are not the roles. Those are just signs of the roles. Now, this idea, so is this kind of weird, the idea of actions being simultaneously formulated and interpreted in two parallel linked planes? You might say this is kind of odd, but in fact, it's not. Language, after all, proceeds in at least two parallel planes, phonology and meaning. We can associate different phonology with the same meaning by switching languages. We can have sound dissociated from meaning, so non-linguistic sounds and nonsense syllables. And we can have meaning dissociated from sound, that's thought. And meaning, or at least other people's meaning, is unobservable without being linked to speech. And just as you can mislead people about your thoughts by uttering sounds linked with a different thought, that's lying, you can mislead about your social intentions by producing physical signals consistent with other intentions, say through facial expression or gesture or disguise. Now, I think it's important, having introduced this social domain, to point out that it's different from the notion of the theory of mind, which often shows up in these contexts right away. Stereotypically, in human social relations, we do attribute a mental life to the persons with whom we interact. But we can also attribute a mental life to entities, animate entities, with which we have no social relation. Say when we're watching a tiger stalking an antelope, we can think about what the tiger is thinking, but we have no social relation to that tiger. We don't hesitate to say the tiger has beliefs and intentions, whether we're correct or not. It's our theory of mind, not the tiger's, we're worried about. On the other hand, many aspects of social relations don't require a theory of mind. For a person to be a member of a certain clan, and therefore to have certain obligations that are part of the rules for that clan, it doesn't matter what they believe or desire, it's just an objective social fact. And also, at least there's some dispute at the moment as to whether monkeys have a theory of mind. A lot of people think they don't, but they certainly have social cognition. So, although the theory of mind plays an important role in human social cognition, I think they're not the same. It's not the same thing as social cognition. It's an overlapping capacity. Okay, so what would be beyond the element of personhood? What would be the kinds of elements and relations that would appear in the social domain? Social psychology has dealt a great deal with person perception. Sociobiology and evolutionary psychology have talked at length about issues like sexual selection and dominance and altruism. So I will leave those alone today and talk about some that are a bit more distant from direct evolutionary justification. The first one is cooperation, which is not exactly the same as altruism. I got into thinking about cooperation actually through my work on lexical semantics, because for over the years I've studied a lot of words that express intention and social coercion, things like intend and persuade. But I had a great deal of trouble with words like cooperate and agree, until I came across a proposal by Searle, of all people, in his book called The Construction of Social Reality. Searle proposes that we're capable of what he calls joint intention. So it's not just I intend to do such and such, it's we intend to do such and such, and my role in it is this. And maybe the simplest case for imagining a joint intention is you're trying to move a piece of furniture together. If I lift one end of the table and push, it doesn't make any sense outside of the context of you're lifting the other end of the table and pulling, so that the jointly intended action of moving the table out the door takes place. This seems just about right to characterize cooperation and agreement. A joint intention is a necessary component of any sort of transaction or trade or contract. And contracts, of course, include, just going zipping through the phenomena, contracts include marriage contracts, which I think at the bottom are declarations of joint intention to maintain sexual exclusivity. For another typical example, Herb Clark, in his book Using Language, argues that joint intention is also a basic aspect of linguistic communication. Using language is not just a speaker imposing information on a hearer, although in a lecture situation it's more like that, I suppose. But in the normal conversation, it's a speaker and a hearer performing a joint task of getting information across, with the hearer giving feedback and asking questions to make things clear and so on. Now, a joint intention is a kind of curious phenomenon because it sort of pretends that two people are sharing their minds. The best approximation that individuals can actually make is for each of them to get assurance from the other that the joint intention is shared. So there have to be signals for offering cooperation and for uptake of the offer, for agreeing to do something jointly. And these can be most explicit in things like signatures on a contract, a handshake, or at least saying, do you want to go to the movies tonight? Okay. So you say okay as an uptake of the joint intention. Or the signals might be more subtle. They might be just little inflections of body language. You start moving in a certain direction and the other person moves a certain way, and that's a signal of joint intention. Now this raises lots of questions. Exactly what sort of cognitive structure is this? Is it a subcase, for example, of Dennett's intentional stance? What are the signals? What kinds of signals of offer and uptake can there be? How are they produced and how are they perceived? And when chimps and wolves cooperate, do they need cognitive structures of joint intention? As I suspect that ants don't need signals of joint intention, but chimps and wolves might. If they don't, what evolutionary precursors do they have that enable them to cooperate the way they do? One important precursor is probably joint attention. So following somebody's gaze to see where they're looking, which doesn't require theory of mind, right? It can just be, look there, okay, I'm looking there. It doesn't have anything to do with seeing what the other person is seeing. It's just sort of following a point. Another place to look for precursors might be sexual behavior, both courting and actual intercourse, both of which call for a certain amount of physical coordination among individuals. Another might be mother-infant interaction, which at least on the infant's part doesn't require theory of mind, I hope. Now when we start thinking about joint intentions, we're immediately into issues of game theory. So we can have prisoner's dilemma sorts of situations arising from the possibility of defection. So we have a joint intention and I say, haha, I'm leaving, and I leave you in the lurch. Or I might say, I think I'll let him think we're pursuing a joint intention, but really, when we get over there, I'm going to defect. When we get the money, I'm going to defect, right? So theory of mind does enter into the constant checking as to whether joint intention is taking place, and cheater detection along the lines of Tooby and Cosmides obviously plays a role in maintaining joint intention. I started to think, again, thinking like a linguist, you say, well, could there be an opposite of joint intention, namely doing something knowingly but against each other instead of with each other? And I thought maybe that's competition, where each participant knows that the other is out to get him. So there's, in some sense, a joint project of exploiting each other. This is more complex than I will just exploit you and protect myself. So taking somebody by surprise and attacking them by surprise is not competition, but facing each other and fighting it out is competition in this sense. But competition is not totally symmetrical with cooperation, because you can't take advantage of your competitor by defecting, right? If you run away, you've lost, not won. So the only way to opt out of competition possibly is to surrender, unless it's, which is some kind of, so that's one way of opting out, and you lose rather than win if you defect. Or there might be a joint decision, a cooperative decision to abandon the activity. That might be another way to end competition. This is all very eerie in the context of what's going on out in the world, isn't it? Anyway, we'll continue. It keeps being eerie. I didn't expect this to be happening when I gave this talk, but here we are. Next thing I want to talk about is group membership. Among the most important elements of social structure, I think, is the logic of groups. And there are the fundamental premise of this logic is that some set of individuals constitute a group and everybody else is out of the group. And it seems to me that you can write some axioms for the logic of groups, and there they are in the handout. If you're a member of my group, I'll behave favorably toward you. I'll be willing to cooperate with you, and I expect you to do the same. Axiom 2, if you're not a member of my group, I'll behave unfavorably toward you. That is, I'll compete with you, and I'll expect you to compete with me. Possibly, axiom 3, we in the group have the joint intention of competing with those not in the group. So I've stated it rather neutrally. It could be much more blatantly stated, I suppose. But if you think about it, this logic pertains to primate groups, I think, and to every kind of human group, all the way from cliques of teenagers to nations with professions and religions and social classes in between. And I leave it to you to work that out, but I think you'll find it familiar. The hallmarks that go with this are feelings of pride in one's own group, a sense of the superiority of your group to other groups. I'm proud, I'm a whatever it is, right? And sometimes a loss of individual ego within group identity. You know, I'm so glad I will do anything for the group. I'm so glad to be a member of this group. Groups often stage events that reinforce group identity. These include rituals that grant membership or status, such as coming-of-age ceremonies, coronations, marriages, and awards ceremonies. But funerals and football games can also play this role in the ecology of groups, and I guess wars. The relations among groups are conceptualized, I think, as though a group is a super individual. Like an individual, a group can exert dominance over another, can compete with another, or form alliances for cooperation with another. In turn, these relations are inherited, in a sense, by the members of the group. So a member of a dominant group will presume personal dominance over a member of a subordinate group. And this is, a basis for racism. And members of groups that are allied with each other are more likely to show affiliative behavior than members of competing or hostile groups. I leave it to you to make up the examples. They're every place. In order to assure the continued cohesion of a group, many groups will find it necessary to enforce axiom 1, namely, cooperate with group members. You have to enforce it against members who choose not to cooperate. So groups often then have a code of conduct, a set of normative principles, and I'll come back to normative principles in a few moments. My sense is that code of conduct is understood as a joint commitment of the members. Joint commitment is a new kind of type that I don't recall seeing anywhere in the literature. We have joint beliefs, joint intentions, as in Searle, and now I think joint commitments. What does it mean that there's a joint commitment? This means that punishment for violating the code is understood as collectively imposed by the group. In smaller, less formal groups, the sanctions are usually imposed collectively. Just everybody is nasty to you if you didn't behave right towards anybody in the group. In larger groups, more complex groups, you have to invent institutions that grant authority to certain individuals. You need a police force that imposes the sanctions on behalf of the group. And I think one of the worst sanctions that can be imposed universally is expulsion from the group. And all this is part of the logic of groups. All of this comes together as a package, it seems. Now, of course, this makes it very important to determine who's in and who's out of the group, especially when groups get so large that members are not necessarily acquainted with one another. So, we have to invent characteristic dress and customs and manners of speaking to identify each other. maybe systems of admission for some kinds of groups, and procedures for determining your descent. Usually if you're descended from a member of the group, you become a member of the group. And this applies not just for nationalities, but academic professions. So, you know, I get to be a linguist for free because I studied with a linguist. I have the right pedigree. But on the other hand, there's often a sharp presumption, a presumption of a sharp distinction between members and non-members, a demand of some sort of purity. And again, in academia, I'm in trouble because I'm not exactly a linguist. I think too much about psychology, but I'm not exactly a psychologist because I don't run experiments. So I fall in this, am I a bridge between the groups, or do I fall between the cracks? It's never clear. And that's typical of what happens when somebody of mixed parentage or mixed descent. And it becomes more difficult because humans typically identify with numerous overlapping and hierarchical groups, some more formal than others. So should I act at any particular moment, or am I being understood at any particular moment by, let's say, you, as a linguist, as a cognitive scientist, as an educator, an American, God forbid, a member of my family, a member of my extended family, a Jew, a conservative Jew of Eastern European descent? Which group is the relevant one at this moment for determining how I behave and what I do? And I'm sure you're familiar with these sorts of conflicts in your lives. And what happens is then those people who insist on group purity have a hard time dealing with people of mixed grouping, and this lies behind the outcast status which is often accorded to people who make the mistake of being of mixed background. And I think we take for, in studying not only our culture, but in others, we take for granted this logic of groups. I mean, everything I said sounds perfectly natural, I think. Just totally intuitive. And now this raises the developmental issue. Do children learn all this? Or do they understand the logic of groups innately, and they just plug it into any groups with which they come to associate? Given that there's a parallel, though maybe less complex instantiation of this logic in many primate societies, I'd be inclined to vote for a substantial innate component. We might also ask if there are socially impaired individuals who never understand this logic, or if it can be disrupted by brain damage. I've never heard of anything to this effect, but maybe nobody's ever looked. You know something? No? Now, I think there's one interesting variable parameter in the customs of a group that relates to the axioms 2 and 3, how you behave towards members of other groups. And it has to do with how intensely you apply them, how rigidly you apply them. It seems to me, from what little I know of history, Islam in the Middle Ages and also during the Ottoman Empire seems to have had a live and let live attitude towards other religions and ethnicities, in sharp contrast to contemporary fundamentalist Islam. They both made the distinction between our group and everybody else, but how much did they say, well, I'm going to beat up on the other people and try to get rid of them? It seems to me it was much less in various past eras. Similarly, it seems to me the catastrophe in the former Yugoslavia in the last decade can be seen in large part as coming from a radical shift in the public face of this parameter. How tolerant are you, if you're a Serbian, of Croatians or Bosnians? And it changed radically in a very short time. For what reasons? Well, that's interesting to discuss. And maybe the intolerance was at least simmering below the surface for decades, but it became public, and that's what led to the breakup. And I don't think I need to multiply the horrible examples. It seems to me the value of this parameter, the intensity of applying axioms 2 and 3, is one thing that's learned by individuals from their culture. Publicly, I think American society and most of Western society applauds efforts to teach tolerance, but this impulse is far from universal. Even those who advocate tolerance often act otherwise. Oh, this is really depressing to talk about this today. Yes. Now, let's go on. Okay, we'll start another topic, and it'll get depressing too, probably. All of these structures, cooperation, competition, and group membership, have to be integrated into your course of action from moment to moment. One of these elements of integrating might be called framing. This is a term that I've borrowed from Irving Goffman. Maybe the easiest place to see framing is in the context of games, which, as far as I know, are found in every culture. What we see most saliently in a game is the element of competition. There are two or more people knowingly trying to outdo each other at something or another. But this competition is set within a larger framework of cooperation. The participants agree to play, and they agree to abide by set rules and a presumption of fairness. If a game were only competition without this larger frame around it, poker players would be simply trying to steal each other's money. Right? There would be no game there, no rules. Of course, the card sharp is being deceptive about the frame of cooperation, or he's putting it in a still larger frame of exploitation. He is trying to steal the other person's money. If in the course of a game somebody breaks a rule, the game's progress is suspended until matters are set right. Sometimes the game itself has sort of meta rules to say what happens when a rule is broken. But sometimes a violation of the rules will lead to degenerate. The frame is broken and it leads to dispute or even violence because it denotes a defection from the larger frame of cooperation. Okay, again, let's turn that inside out. If the framing of a game is competition within cooperation, could there be the opposite? Cooperation framed inside of competition or hostility. This seems to me an interesting characterization of bargaining, where each participant wants things the other has and is trying to get as much as possible. That's the competition part. But this competition is carried on with a facade of civility so that the participants don't end up beating each other up and stealing. So that's a possible, you begin to see some of the algebraic possibilities here. We have another level of complexity in team sports where each team forms a group whose joint intention is to compete with the other team, all within a frame of cooperation with the other team. And think about what this entails in real time. A team member has to gauge his or her actions with respect to multiple individuals, both the people on your own team and the people on the other team, establish joint sub-intentions very fast through some kind of signaling, we don't know what, and coordinate those with physical activity. So there's very fast processing going on in the social domain as well as the physical domain in a team sport. And you can adopt this whole overarching frame of a team game on the spur of a moment. So kids decide to play football or something in a playground. They just, let's do it, and there they go, and they set up the frame and they're playing. Or it could be a lasting relationship where teams are affiliated with larger groups, let's say the Boston Red Sox, and the games are proxy for larger group competition and serve as ritual events that reinforce group identity. And again, we hear of the violence that erupts through the competition, when the frame of cooperation gets broken. Now, all of this is informal and descriptive, but I think it's a necessary prelude, again, to asking the harder question, the one of cognitive neuroscience. What computational and or neural mechanisms do we have to posit in order to produce this ability to frame and reframe recursively, and in order to permit the learning of this kind of behavior? Team sports are understood without any trouble by 10 or 11-year-old children, though not by other primates as far as we know. So that's kind of a boundary condition. But I don't know what to make of it. So this is more about asking of questions than giving answers. Now let's turn to rules. Let's think, which are easiest to think about as another aspect of games. But in fact, rules show up in many, many different domains. And I think they all have a general form. Given a particular frame or context, you must or should do or not do something or another. And if we spell it out a little more explicitly, it's something like, in this context, if you do such and such a consequence, which might be of good value or of bad value to you, depending on the rule, will take place. So something good will happen to you if you do this, or something bad will happen to you if you do this, or don't do this. And different sorts of rules differ in the kinds of frames that they invoke and the kinds of consequences that they promise or threaten. So in a game, the rules create a space of action within which various rewards or penalties obtain, and breaking the rules incurs a penalty or breaks the frame. Those are the easiest cases. An obligation, or a contract, or a promise specifies certain actions that the holder of the obligation has to perform for the benefit of the person to whom the obligation is made. So if I fail to meet my obligation to you, you get the right to perform some action that harms me. That's the way it works. So if you violate an obligation to somebody, that person gets a right to harm you. That doesn't mean they have to, but they might. Depending on the sort of obligation, you may be entitled to punish me yourself, or you may have to appeal to the group as a whole or to the group's designated authority, the police, to impose punishment on me. Another kind of rule is a legal code, which designates certain actions as desired or sanctioned by the authority of the group as a whole, and the consequences of reward or punishment are carried out by designated representatives who act as proxy for the group. Next, a system of moral or ethical rules, which I think designate certain courses of action as morally good and others as morally bad, again, leaving others neutral. As far as I can see, the consequences that are associated with morality have to do with moral rules, generally concern the approval and trust of the community members. If you do something morally good, people think more of you and trust you more. If you do something morally bad, the opposite. And trust in an individual, in turn, translates into higher status and so increased interest in cooperative enterprises with this individual. So there's a point in being, if one looks for sort of, people talk in evolutionary terms about morality growing out of the need to win people's trust so they will cooperate with you so you can do better. So being morally good is ultimately in your self-interest. Those arguments are going on at the moment, and I don't know whether I believe them or not, but it looks interesting. Finally, religious codes replace approval by the community in the moral codes with approval by the deity or the deities. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the consequence isn't just approval or disapproval by God. It's specific reward or punishment, I guess in Christianity, having to do with the afterlife, right? Where do you end up when you die? In Jewish tradition, the religious code is seen as a contract between God and the people. And I could go on and cite many other kinds of rules. Parents' rules for their children, rules of etiquette, and I imagine you could think of others. But I think they're basically all of the same form. They differ in the frames in which they're applied and in the general form of the consequences. Now, as you may have noticed, and from my generalization earlier, a second ago, the language used to express all of these sorts of rules is pretty much the same. It involves words like should and must and may and right and wrong. So these different kinds of rules are not always clearly distinguished. Now, often, so for example, moral codes are often equated with religious codes. Now, often aspects of religious codes do state moral principles, but more generally, I think they're not necessarily the same. You can have a moral or ethical code independently of religion. Think of honor among thieves, for example, or maybe the desert traditions of hospitality. And many religious codes hardly fall in the moral or ethical domain. I'm thinking about, how you have to perform a particular religious ceremony. You bow 3 times and sprinkle the blood. That's not a moral issue, that's just a religious code. Similarly, some of the literature on promises that I've come across conflates the contractual and ethical domains. They say the consequence of breaking a promise is disapproval by the community. It's bad to break promises. It's an ethical the promise is an ethical thing. What they don't observe is that there's also a contractual breach if you break a promise. The person to whom you've made the promise has a very specific right. They don't just disapprove of you, they can get back at you for breaking your promise. So breaking a promise has a consequence in both domains. Similarly, legal contracts, as opposed to just promises among individuals, have consequences in both the contractual and legal domains. And a particular action may have conflicting consequences in different normative domains. A classic case is in the melodrama, where the evil landlord is foreclosing on the mortgage of the poor widow and he's going to take her house away from her. So he's exercising his contractual right. According to the contract and the law, he's entitled to do that, but it's not moral to do that. In the other direction is something like nonviolent civil disobedience along the lines of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, where they're violating the legal code, but they take it to be expressing a higher moral code. More generally, my sense is that at best, explicit legal and religious codes are intended to be imperfect incarnations of a more inchoate sense of morality. But of course, at worst, legal and religious codes can be used to legitimate the raw exercise of power. So there's another depressing note. Anyway, so we have to observe the distinctions among these different kinds of rules. At the same time, we shouldn't push the distinctions too hard. Turiel's has widely cited experiments that show that young children readily distinguish norms that we might call social conventions, things we could decide to change. They distinguish those from things that we couldn't change, that is genuine morality. So they'll ask a little kid, you know, if somebody went out to play in the playground and took their clothes off, would it be good? And that child says, no, not good. They say, well, if the teacher said it was all right, would it be okay? I said, yeah, it would be okay. Or they'll say, suppose a kid goes out on the playground and starts beating up another kid. Good or bad? And they say, no, not good. And say, if the teacher said it would be okay, would it be okay? And they'd say, no, still not good. Okay? So this is at, 4 years old or something, they make this distinction quite readily. They know the difference between a social convention and morality in some sense. And I think a number of researchers who are following this lead, as well as I think standard moral philosophy, have taken the view that we should really look at morality in isolation and strip away all the social convention. And I want to take a minute to disagree with this view for 4 reasons. First of all, I have the impression that cultures differ in what they themselves consider morality as opposed to social convention. So beating up people is usually immoral in every culture, but there are a lot of differences having to do with sexual behavior and certainly slavery, where many cultures think slavery is immoral and other cultures think it's perfectly okay. And if you think it's immoral, you think it couldn't be changed. So that's one issue, that what different cultures view different things as moral and unchangeable. Second, if we look at a culture from the outside, what looks to us like social convention and what looks to us like morality seem to be mixed up with each other quite a bit, inextricably. And I'll just take a Judeo-Christian example. If you look at the 10 Commandments, you'll find side by side, keep the Sabbath, certainly social convention, and don't kill, which is, we would say, from our moral philosophy point of view, is moral. And in fact, they have the same punishment. If you look in the book of Exodus, I can give you the verses if you like. Violating both of them is punishable by death. What's moral and what's social convention? The 10 Commandments doesn't care. They're all, mixed up with each other. By the time you get to later rabbinical literature, they make the distinction, but not in the Bible. Third reason is that keeping track of all these different kinds of norms is that morality is deeply tied up with the logic of groups. For instance, killing the enemy in a war is not a violation of don't kill. It's just what you're supposed to do. It's good, unless you're the enemy, of course, but it's not. more deeply than that, there's a sociologist named Jane Jacobs who proposes that in fact human societies universally have two partly independent systems of morality with partly contradictory principles. One of them she calls the guardian syndrome, and it concerns how to keep the group cohesive and defend it against aggression from other groups. The other one she calls the commercial syndrome, and it concerns how to participate in trade with other groups. And these two moral systems, she argues, coexist somewhat uneasily in every successful society, and the trick is to know when to apply each one. And that again may vary from society to society. So those are three sort of empirical reasons for looking at this larger system and not just strict morality. But I think there's a fourth reason, a theoretical reason. One of the motives for isolating morality from everything else is to try to discover genuine human nature beneath the variations of culture. But this view incorrectly takes the variations of culture to be superficial and uninteresting. Let's go back to the study of language. Universal grammar in linguistics is not what's universal in language. It's a theory of the child's ability to learn language. It has to take into account the range of variation underlying the range of variation among languages, what happens frequently, what never happens, what's easy for children to learn, and what's difficult. Similarly, I think in looking for the aspects of human nature that underlie human society, we can't just insist on the universals of culture. We should be looking at the range of variation and how the common issues of humanity play out cross-culturally. So the system of norms as a whole seems a more ecologically appropriate object of study, particularly given the empirical considerations that I've just raised. Now, one thing that intrigues me about this is the way normative rules are all taken to be objective entities in the world. Abstract ones, but objective. We know that they're made up by people, but they're hardly imaginary. Within a game, I objectively win and lose. If I break a promise or I fail to pay my taxes, the consequences are real. So rules, once they're established, are practically as irresistible as laws of physical causality. In particular, rules that we call moral are conceptualized as timeless and universal, whether or not they're really timeless and universal from a cross-cultural perspective. And this is why many people find the idea of moral relativism so disgusting. They say if a rule is relative, it can't be moral. Morality has to be timeless and universal. Again, it would be of interest to explore children's understanding of all these kinds of rules. And there, as I've mentioned, there is some literature on this now, building on Piaget, Kohlberg, and Turiel over the last 70 years. There are now all kinds of people working on it, including people here. Now we're getting into very tricky territory, and then I will end. These kinds of issues about rules and morality and groups and so on run below the surface of a lot of intense public debate, and not to mention thousands of years of religious and philosophical discourse. The question is, what is the source of moral and ethical rules and values, particularly those that are conceptualized as universal and timeless? Why should we see anything as a universal ethical principle? When I talked about efforts to teach tolerance in a positive way, what justified that? Why shouldn't we instead applaud efforts to teach xenophobia and white male supremacy, let's say? A great deal of the Western and especially American tradition has regarded moral values as given by God, for instance, in Jefferson's phrase, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. And I'm given to understand that Islam takes a similar stance. All this stuff comes from God. Now, when Darwin published Origin of Species, everybody sort of caught on that evolutionary theory was a great threat to this. And certainly in the United States, the reaction against Darwin is a part of the rise of religious fundamentalism and the continuing hostility to evolution. Because if morals are not given absolutely and timelessly by God, where do they come from? If they're relative or subjective, just made up by people. Why can't you make them up any way you want? How can you argue against Nazis or communism or secular humanism or drugs and free love or whatever you want? It's better to trust in God and use what God says to get what you want. And this would be to be grounded in a society that doesn't rely on a particular God's authority, that is, within the global society that we all now live. And I don't think that people who oppose the fundamentalists, the religious fundamentalists and the economic Darwinists really try to answer the question. They just assert a different moral code and point out the contradictions and helpings of self-interest in the right-wing position. Now, and I'm not sure that evolutionary psychology can provide a proper grounding for values either, although maybe it can offer some boundary conditions. Let me, if you'll stick with me 3 more minutes, let me offer 2 contrasting situations. First has to do with sexual selection. It was well established by evolutionary psychology. Dawkins makes this case in great detail, but I think it goes back earlier than him, that there's an asymmetry between males and females in reproductive strategy. Reproduction is a small investment for a male and a large investment for a female. And this asymmetry drives lots of behavioral asymmetries observed in lots of species. One particular game theoretic consequence is that males are more likely or more inclined to be sexually promiscuous than females. And this is a phenomenon that we observe in humans as well. But we wouldn't want to argue from this biologically driven logic that this is the way it should be, that we should condone or even encourage male promiscuity. Morality ought to be properly distanced from biology here. And even here I have to say ought. What do I mean by ought here? Now, a contrasting case. One aspect of the logic of groups that I mentioned earlier is that the group protects its members from aggression by other group members. So we have a legal system that punishes physical aggression like assault, but also economic aggression like stealing. And there's similar institutions in every culture, even in the absence of written legal codes. And in fact, Frans de Waal has observed similar things in chimp groups. Dominant individuals will often step in to break up fights. Now, if we look at modern free market capitalism, the argument is businesses should be free to exploit people economically. The government shouldn't be allowed to protect citizens from such exploitation. This distorts the market or something. Capitalism is, of course, based on bargaining as the basic interaction, which, remember, on my analysis, is a form of aggression, just masked by civility. But it's still aggression. So globalization is an attempt on the part of corporations to operate outside the group's constraints. That is, they're lawless pirates. So we might conclude that the basic premises of free market capitalism and globalization go against the universal logic of groups, as established by the theory of social cognition. And I did make this argument in Patterns in the Mind. But if we take this as an argument against free market capitalism, then we also have to take the argument against sexism and male promiscuity equally seriously. And so here's where a place where I don't know how to tease it apart anymore. The point to remember is that these issues are bound to come up. Sociobiology got clobbered because people started talking about inherited individual differences, and they didn't see it coming, and so they fell into disrepute after 5 or 10 years because they were not alert to the political implications of what they were proposing. In order to do this kind of study, I think we have to be alert to the political the political implications or the political paths running in parallel, so that this work does not get taken away from us by political demagogues who want to make all kinds of nasty points. That's not to say that a theory of social cognition can provide the answers, but it can, I think, provide some understanding of what's going on and what we think we're doing when we're establishing moral codes. But at the moment, I don't see how it can tell us what the correct moral code is. And So I want to end by saying we have to.
Question is, do you consider that social cognition is a module, and if so, is it encapsulated or isolated from the rest of the so-called conceptual structure?
I think the primitives of social cognition are to a great extent separate from those of physical understanding. So it's two systems that run in parallel, and there's rich interaction between them, of course, because social actions are symbolized or signaled by physical actions. So is it encapsulated? Well, no. But it's its own formal system with its own formal properties, quite distinct from those of space. So it's kind of a natural break in concepts. I mean, I don't buy into Fodor's idea that central cognition is just completely wild and anything goes. I think it's equally constrained, but the interactions in there are much richer than they are in the perceptual systems, perhaps.
Okay, I would like to come back to your very start of your talk and the analogy, deep analogy. You said there was between the acquisition of social cognition and that of language, and I would like to argue against this analogy. So you're exaggerated. So first you draw a parallel between, I quote, unlimited number of understandable sentences on the one hand and unlimited number of understandable social situations. It seems the situation is quite different as I see it. In the case of sentences, you have an infinity of them because there's a system that generates them. Now for any utterance, any two utterances, you can ask the question, are they tokens of the same types? And normally the answer is yes or no. Regarding the unlimited number of understandable social situations, it all depends on what kind of description you give of them. There is no level of description like that provided by the grammar. So, for instance, if we last time we shook hands, are they tokens of the same type? Yes, under the description of shaking hands. But of course, the details of the social situation were each time different, and we were competent and aware of that. So, depending on the fine-grainedness of a description, where you can get just a few social situations, a limited number of types, actually, you can list them, or you can indeed construct them in a deeper and deeper manner. And the issue is, well, in social competence, how much fine-grainedness is involved, and are the levels. So it's, in any case, what you have to acquire to be socially competent is very different from what you have to acquire when you acquire grammar. And also it can tolerate much greater difference in levels of competence than you can have in the case of language. And if I may just a second, this analogy has to do with rules. Of course, the notion of rules is a commonsensical notion when we talk about social rules, not when we talk about grammatical rules. And the rules we talk about in the social sphere are typically conscious rules. And again, commonsensically, we know the rules, they're being explained, they're being told, and so on. Now, it comes as a discovery first in the social science that there may be some rules we're not quite aware of. But it doesn't. But the social notion of rules doesn't extend beyond that of rules that, even if we're not quite aware of them, we may bring them to consciousness and recognize them. The notion of rules in grammar, it's the same word, but it has very little, precious little to do. It's just little to do. It's a technical notion serving quite different purpose. It's not on the model of the rules you describe later, etc. So again, here it's a false analogy. It's the same word, but certainly not the same notion.
I guess I would, let me take these in reverse order. I think in terms of studying social interaction structurally, we're in the analogous point to 1956, before syntactic structures, where it was not clear that there were rules of language other than the ones that people knew consciously, and the idea of an infinity of sentences was not even raised. Chomsky says, well, Humboldt talked about it, but it was not part of the common description of language at that point, not the central notion, right? And when you look at these people who describe social situations in a thick sort of way, and you say, oh, yes, I recognize all those intuitions, say, there's a lot more going on here than I thought about, and it's all going on probably unconsciously, but I think you can recognize it better than you can recognize, let's say, linguistic constructions. I think they're closer to the surface of consciousness and I agree with you there. But I think that it's really the competence that it takes to do the things that we totally take for granted in social situations. So taking into account people's roles, and people's official roles and people's personal roles, and principles of politeness and principles of where we are in the, is it appropriate to do this in the street or in the bedroom? All of these things that we completely take for granted. I think if we start looking for a rich description of the social understanding of appropriateness and how one acts, that it's going to be at least as complex as language and multidimensional. That's my bet. Okay, and so we have to try and find out.
And again, the complexity, but I don't think the level of complexity, the form of the complexity may be quite different.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and that's why it's not like there aren't going to be necessarily relative clauses in although I have relative clauses on Thursday in complex action.
Still a follow-up on the first three questions. So just to follow up on Dan, I think there's an unlimited number of visual scenes that you can see, and it's not clear that you need a rule system in vision. I don't know, I'm not sure, but so it doesn't seem to be the correct reason for needing a rule system in social cognition. Nevertheless, I agree that there's probably a need for a rule system in social cognition. And then when you said that at the beginning of the talk, I took it to imply that you need a dedicated generative system for social cognition, just like you have dedicated generative systems in language. But then that didn't seem to follow from the rest of the talk. So do you really believe that you need a dedicated generative system for social cognition, or are you just using the generative conceptual system applied to some subdomain of thought with perhaps specific primitives?
As I said, I think there are specific primitives involved in social cognition with specific kinds of inferences that run over them that are independent of the inferences one runs over physical space. Although one often uses the physical space as a symbol or as a signal of what's going on in the social domain. Whether it's a dedicated grammar or a module, I don't care too much. I just think we ought to explore the forms of knowledge and see where it leads us. It's not like language in that, well, it has, maybe face perception is a dedicated input-output mechanism. Face recognition, voice recognition are all dedicated input-output systems that are telling us who the character is, because that's really important that we're interacting with, and what frame of mind they're in, right? Are they angry? Are they pleasant? Are they in a good mood? Are they disliking me? Are they threatening? Are they wooing me? Or whatever. Those are dedicated input-output systems, and what I'm interested in is what's the central system that those are providing information to. I think you'll agree with me that the kinds of inferences that I talked about here, having to do with groups and framing and rules and so forth, are not physical principles. They don't have to do with the understanding of space. So as far as really laying out what this is, I don't want to say, well, I'm pushing a very strong Chomskyan line or a very strong Fodorian line. Just want to say, let's explore this knowledge using the kinds of Chomskyan questions, but not presuming the kinds of Chomskyan answers, and see what happens.
I have two small questions. The first one is that you compare social cognition and language, and of course there are many similarities between both, but maybe there is something in social cognition that you can't find in language, which is emotions and also violence. And so how would you use these two specificities as to compare social cognition to language? And maybe I can ask the second question, yes, so you can choose. And the second point is just you seem to consider that it's that's the fact that social convention and morality are intertwined is like a fact and something that we have to start with. But maybe this is also a developmental question. And I'm just thinking about the issue that you raised, that morality is combined, intertwined with social cognition and especially with religion. And I'm thinking about data by Larry Nucci and Toyer, who has been working with very religious communities, like very Orthodox Jewish people and Amish people, as you know, and he seems to have shown that very young children, like 6 to 8 years old children, were much more able to distinguish between moral rules and religious rules than adults and older people. And so it may be just a developmental concern, and maybe we might be interesting to start with the distinction and to see how both get intertwined. What would you think about that?
Well, I think to say it's just a developmental question is to minimize the importance of development. I mean, language, there's certainly a developmental question. You know, do you end up with a tone system? Do you end up with a case system? Do you end up with a stress system? How it ends up and which parameters available in language are used by the language in your environment, that's certainly a developmental question. And so the issue of what does the child start with has to include what is the child capable of learning. I mean, I think basically what makes culture like language, and the anthropologists recognized this a long time ago and took the opposite view, right, is this is a huge part of human life that's learned and varies across the map. And what Chomsky did was to say, how can we make this biological? And in order to make it biological, we have to talk about the learning theory and the innate constraints on learning. And so I think the essence of what I'm proposing is that we should do the same thing with culture. And what I'm proposing here are some of the issues with which a theory of culture has to deal, which, like things in language, are so natural. The notion of a normative rule, the notion of a group, the notion of a frame, they're so natural that everybody does them. Nobody even notices they're there. And children, by the time they're 10, just have them all worked out. And, you know, there's fine-tuning, you know, that you learn more about sex as you're going through adolescence, I guess. And that's where I see the analogy. So the purpose of going through all these examples is to say, here are some parts of culture that you find every place with cultural variation, just like you find relative clauses every place, but with variation. So what does the child have to learn, and what is there given in the framework that says this is going to be an issue that a culture has to have some solution to? Now, how does your first question was about emotion. Yes, and valence. Valence, so it's good, it's bad, as a fundamental notion of value, moral, ethical, legal, in a game, those kinds of things. It seems to me that that's just a fundamental part of the, one of the predicates of value or valence that is basic in all kinds of social cognition. Now, you're quite right, this also applies to emotions. Emotions are positive or negative, maybe in several dimensions. I haven't kept up on the literature in that. And there are emotions associated with certain social situations, embarrassment, guilt, shame, but also, the religious ones like transcendence. Is that a social? I don't know if that's social, religious transcendence, but religious ceremonies can bring it on. So it's in a social context maybe that one experiences it most commonly, unless one is a hermit in the desert or something. At the moment, I don't see how to interlock it, and you're quite right. It doesn't play the same role in language. It's not the same formal system. We shouldn't expect any of the same formal machinery in language and culture. It's just that they present the same problem to learning that I'm interested in.
You would agree that if you want to see if there's a specific faculty of social cognition, you want to tease apart, you want to look for aspects that are not dependent on either language, acquisition of a language, or on theory of mind. So you'd want to look and see what you find, for instance, in people that don't either that haven't yet acquired language for some reason, or that don't have, maybe because they're too young, or because they can't have a theory of mind. So ask what, for instance, what kind of social cognition do you see with autistic children, with 3-year-olds, and various things like that. So what do you think the chances are of finding, what would be your candidates, just maybe you've already said this, for things that you would find in people that don't have a theory of mind and that don't have language, that would distinguish human beings from, say, other animals in the area of social cognition?
I think it's too soon to say. I have a prejudice against theory of mind, in the sense that people invoke it all the time and nobody's really said what it is. You know, it's often defined operationally in terms of they fail the Smarties task. You know, but there are lots of other things involved in theory of mind. So it's, and then, or, you know, autistics don't have it. Well, autistics don't have lots of things. So
They could be good chess players.
they might be good chess players. Who knows? Yeah. Also, if you say, well, let's look at impaired individuals, it might be looking at, well, how much of language can you get if you're deaf and have no exposure to sign language? So it might be that having all of these other faculties intact might be necessary to develop full social cognition. I'm sort of not prepared to give any answers. I mean, again, we're in 1956. So I think we ought to, you know, I at least personally, would like to work on this, work on the formal system of the logic of social cognition and see where all these different parts come in, because clearly all these different threads play a role in social cognition. The input systems, the emotions, but also the internal things like groups and rules and dominance and sex and all those things. So let's try and see. You know, I'm starting to pick away at some of these things. On Thursday, my talk is, I started to say, well, let's start dealing with actions. And I ended up doing the stupidest, silliest action, and it already got so complicated that I didn't get to the social part, really. So my suspicion is the social actions are even more complicated. But we need to understand all kinds of systems to get this to work. And so it's a spur to do more things the way we do linguistics. I want to make a remark about the visual field, by going back to your question. Whether we call it a grammar or not that enables us to understand, when we look around this room, that there are people sitting behind tables with things on the table and things on the things, and some things behind each other, and some of them are capable of moving and some of them are not, and so on and so forth. You might not call it a grammar, but there is some sort of logic of how the objects in the room are arranged. And nobody in vision that I know of is trying to do this. Some people in computer vision do it with the blocks world, where it's really very stereotyped. But nobody's taken this approach in the psychology of vision that I know of. But that's, you know, they're still interested in how do you recognize a cup, not a cup behind another cup on the table next to some papers with a pen on them and writing on the paper, and people behind that. You know, the whole visual field. And there again, whether you call it a grammar or something else, I don't really care, but there is a combinatorial explosion here of objects in this room and points of view from which it can be viewed. That is part of our visual competence, and we have to understand that too.
When you claim that there are the hopes for grounding morality in evolutionary psychology are dubious, you take a very strong case, which is condoning sexual promiscuity by males because it's got an evolutionary game theoretical basis. But of course, you're telling only one half of the story, which is that on average, a population of highly promiscuous male is incompatible with a population of highly monogamous females. So if you have promiscuity on one side, on average you have to have promiscuity on the other side. They have to balance somewhere. So there is an obvious conflict of interests here between promiscuity and monogamy. And morality could just be informed by the options which are available in the mathematical space here of a possible solution. So you can have very many monogamous females and only a few very promiscuous females to balance. And that would be an option which is just reflected in some moral choices. And it's not a strong form of grounding, but the evolutionary landscape here and the mathematical possibilities give you some of the solutions which are then endorsed by morality. So the interesting grounding would be whether you find a correlation between those solutions as predicted by evolutionary reflections on the possible outcomes and actual moral conducts.
Right. So, I mean, if you look across the animal kingdom, you find different solutions, right? You find elephant seals with harems, and most of the males don't get to mate at all, right? So that's one extreme. Also, some of the baboons, right? There's some kind of baboon where the males have 50 females that they, or 10 that they drag along with them, and gorillas too, I believe. And that means most of the males don't get to mate. So there's a lot of dominance fights and stuff like that. And in human systems, you know, you would get harems, and you would get prostitution, right? You concentrate the female promiscuity in a few individuals who sort of take up the slack. And what you find is also in species that are supposed to be monogamous, they're now finding that all the monogamous birds, the girls fool around a little bit too, right? They do DNA tests on the little baby birds and find out, you know, usually 10 to 20% of them have a different dad. So you're absolutely, I mean, but each culture can say, this is my morality, right? And however it works out. And so the morality settled on by a particular culture is contingent. And so I think you're right that we can see the options provided by different moral systems possibly as provided by evolutionary psychology, but on the other hand we don't want to say, well, you know, suppose we could prove that slavery is an option in a, you know, optimal solution in the landscape.
Just something for weak grounding.
Yes,
not
right.
A strong,
yeah.
normative grounding, but just an explanatory.
Well, I think that's right, and we have to see how it works out. I think that's the direction the evolutionary psychologists are going. I think they would be helped a lot by having a formal theory that is not just sort of game theoretic and statistical, but one that really has a logic in it. That's what, you know, I would hope anyway.
Can I just follow up on this mathematical game as a kind of default value on which morality could develop? I think, okay, you said that you have to regard both sides, and mathematically speaking, there will be only certain possibilities provided. And I think the kinship system has been seen in such a way, let's say if you have laws who can marry whom, in some cases the laws will just reflect the default statistical value. But what morality does is just not stay there, but kind of exploit it and go on, and that's just what morality is about. You don't stay with the statistical, mathematical option you're given as a default value, but I mean, that's what gives rise to the cultural variation, and that's the thing to be explained. And if culture, as you said, is finally has a biological basis, as language has, then I think to want to resort to people without language or without social cognition, that's not the good test to show what's going on. I mean, linguists have achieved the things they have achieved, not looking at people who have been deprived of language, but they have looked at people who possess language. And I don't see why social cognition shouldn't go that way. And then perhaps you will see that the rules you find so conscious are much more subconscious or unconscious as you think.
I think I agree with that.
concerning rules, you're in the page 4. You're talking about on the handout. You talk about rules, and you say that most of the time they are expressed by language, by verbs like should, must, may. But if you think about custom rules that are learned in a particular culture, I mean, in a particular cultural situation, there are plenty of rules of how things are done in a particular way that are indicative. I mean, in Milan, men wear long socks, and it's just like this. I mean, I'm sure that this is the effect, kind of, and I mean, it's.
Yes, quite right. Or maybe I don't know. I haven't thought about whether the other kinds of rules have the same characteristic or not. If you're talking about a game, you say the goalie stands here, right? Sort of. So that's probably correct. And then there is nothing in the sentence that really marks it as normative, as opposed to just a fact. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing that marks it linguistically as normative rather than just stating a fact.
The so-called rules, especially the unconscious rules, as they are in syntax, for instance, or semantics. And it seems that the central question is there any combination, there is definitely in the case of language, is there a combination in the case of social rules? It seems that it is for you maybe a necessary condition for us to have some cognitive account of social rules. But it seems that there is, and you will answer, it seems to me that you have no evidence at all that there is any combination there. You could think that all the job is done by very general patterns that are instantiated, and maybe the evolutionary psychology trying to find, sorry, it's just trying to discover such general pattern, but why would you need any combination at this stage? Of course, if we get any evidence, then you would be very happy, but at this stage there is no reason to make such a big hypothesis.
I mean, for example, the issue of framing. If you think of framing a game as competition embedded in cooperation, but bargaining is cooperation embedded in competition. And if you think about in a team game where you're cooperating with your team in competing with the other team, but within a frame of cooperating to play the game, okay, there's nice recursion going on there. I don't know how deep it goes. And again, those are, just simple examples that I've thought of. But if you think of, theory of mind sorts of things. If you're trying to figure out what the other person thinks about that person, what that person thinks that person is thinking, right? In order to figure out how to behave towards this person, when you know that this person, those kinds of things. And those are all, many of those things are social calculations. They have to do with what this person thinks, not just physically about the other person, but some sort of a social attitude. So those are cases, again, where the recursion in language, in belief kinds of sentences, is expressing complicated embedding in the social context as well. Those are, the framing one was in here. The other one I didn't mention just off the top of my head. But I think if we start taking it apart, we'll see all kinds of combination. That's what my bet is. People didn't think language was that complicated either, remember. Right? And a lot of people still don't. They say, oh, language is just a bunch of tendencies and habits and general schemata. And so there's not much to learn. Well, those people are ignoring the last 50 years of linguistics. And there are lots of them out there. That's most of neuroscience and most of cognitive psychology and most of the world, in fact. And I'm suggesting that if we find a way to investigate social structure in its complexity, if you look at Irving Goffman, for example, his book Frame Theory, is it called? Frame theories?
Frame analysis.
Frame analysis, right, thank you. It's tremendously complex, the understanding that goes into very simple situations. And I'm in no position to try to formalize it yet. I just keep it there in the back of my mind. Someday I'll be able to look at that and talk about what's going on in that book, but I can't do it yet. So that's, just trying to persuade you that there's a problem there.
I don't want to discuss about the combinatorial account of vision. I'm sure my colleagues must have some examples, but recently we had a very good talk by Michael Layton of Rutgers University, and I think that he has such an account, combinatorial account of vision.
Okay, good. Is that it? Thank you very much.